Hey guys! Tonight we begin with something a little different from our usual deep dives into kings and queens, empires and revolutions. Tonight we're going to spend a day, just one ordinary day, in the life of an ordinary man. A man you've probably never heard of. A man whose name was never on a monument or a battle plan or a newspaper headline. A man who was, one afternoon in 1941 or 1942, sitting on his porch or behind a factory counter or walking to school, and the next morning was standing in a line at a recruitment office with a cardboard suitcase and a look on his face that was trying very hard to be brave and not quite making it all the way. He was 19, maybe 20. Maybe 25 and married with a kid he'd just started to know. He came from Ohio or Georgia or California or Brooklyn. He'd never been more than 50 miles from the town he was born in. He didn't know where Normandy was. He'd never heard of Guadalcanal. He could not have pointed to the Philippines on a map without a compass and a considerable amount of guesswork. And within 18 months, he would be there. In all of those places. In rain that turned French farmland to ankle-deep mud. In Pacific heat that turned the inside of his helmet into a slow oven. In foxholes in Belgium in December, with his boots frozen to his feet and a letter from home folded in his chest pocket that he'd read so many times the creases had gone soft. This is not the story of the generals. It's not the story of the grand strategic decisions that determined the shape of the post-war world. It's not about Eisenhower or MacArthur or the beaches of Normandy from the perspective of the men who planned them. This is the story of what it felt like on the ground. What he ate. What he slept on. What he thought about in the long, grinding hours between battles. What he wrote home in letters that had to pass through a censor's scissors before they reached his mother's kitchen table. What he laughed at, because if you didn't laugh you'd go under entirely. And what happened to a man's mind after 6 months of being afraid every minute of every day. The Second World War involved between 70 and 85 million people. At its peak during the war, the U.S. Army alone grew to over 8 million men and women in uniform, joined by an additional 3.4 million in the Navy. Most of those millions were people who had been going about their ordinary lives and were then, with varying degrees of enthusiasm and terror, pulled into the largest and most destructive conflict in human history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is genuinely what you come here for. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is. It's extraordinary, every single time, seeing who joins us from around the world. Some of you are listening on your way to work in Manila. Some of you are in bed in Manchester with the lights off and a fan running. Some of you are in living rooms in Texas and kitchens in Brazil and night shifts in Seoul. And all of you found your way here, tonight, to hear about a young man who did something most of us will never have to do. Now dim the lights. Turn the fan or AC on low. Close whatever else is open on your phone. And let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning of it. To the day he stopped being a civilian. The day a man became a soldier in the Second World War did not look the way the recruitment posters suggested. The posters, and there were millions of them, were magnificent pieces of graphic optimism. Broad-shouldered young men in crisp uniforms, jaws set, eyes fixed on some inspiring middle distance, one arm pointing toward an enemy that existed only as a silhouette in the poster's background. The colors were clean. The lines were sharp. The message was straightforward. Your country needs you. This is who you'll be if you answer the call. This is the version of yourself that's waiting on the other side of a signature on a recruitment form. What the posters did not show was the line. The long, shuffling, anxious, sometimes silent line of young men outside every recruitment office in every city and town in America and Britain and Australia and Canada in the weeks after December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor ended whatever remained of the debate about whether to get involved. In 1939, the U.S. Army only had 174,000 soldiers, including the Army Air Forces. The new additions were mostly young Americans who would normally have been pursuing jobs, schooling, and family life, but instead were answering the nation's call to arms. Many of them had never even traveled outside their home state, let alone Europe, Asia, or the Pacific Islands. Think about that number. 174,000 soldiers, in an army that would within 3 years reach 8 million. That is not a scaling exercise. That is a transformation so radical it has no real equivalent in the modern world. It was the military equivalent of taking a corner shop and turning it into the world's largest supermarket chain in the space of about a year. Except the product being manufactured was not groceries but trained, equipped, functional fighting men. And the raw material was the young men standing in that line outside the recruitment office, some of them barely 18, holding their hats in their hands and trying to look like they already knew what they were doing. About 39% of the new recruits volunteered to serve. The remainder were called up through conscription, also known as the draft. The draft. A word with a particular weight to it. The system by which the government informed you, politely but with the full force of law behind the politeness, that your number had come up and it was your turn. You received a notice. You reported. You had a physical examination conducted by military doctors who looked at your body the way a buyer at a livestock market looks at cattle, efficiently, dispassionately, checking for defects. You stood in your underwear in a room with 40 other men you'd never met and answered questions about your health, your vision, your hearing, whether you had flat feet or a heart murmur or any of the long list of conditions that might make you more trouble than you were worth to the United States Army. Most of them passed. Because the Army needed them to pass. Because there was a war on and the standards of physical perfection were, out of simple logistical necessity, somewhat flexible. And then you signed the papers. And just like that, the civilian version of yourself ceased to exist. Preparing these millions of civilians for war would be one of the military's most daunting challenges. You had, in effect, taken a random cross-section of American male civilian life, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from Boston, grocery clerks from Memphis, and you needed to turn them, in the space of 13 weeks, into soldiers. Into men who could take orders without hesitating, move as a unit without thinking, maintain equipment with precision, and walk toward the sound of gunfire without turning around. That was the task. And the institution designed to accomplish it was basic training. Also known, with the particular affection that soldiers reserve for things they survived, as boot camp. Most soldiers who received their basic training went through a transformative experience. Following commands, they practiced the same basic skills over and over, marching, loading, unloading, and cleaning their weapons. Drill instructors used tough methods to force the newcomers to become attentive to detail and protocol. The first morning was always the shock. You arrived expecting some version of the posters. You got something considerably more bracing. Before the sun was fully up, before you'd had time to properly locate the bathroom or understand the geography of the barracks, a man who seemed to have been specifically engineered to be the loudest possible version of a human being was 2 inches from your face informing you, in language your grandmother would not have approved of, that everything you thought you knew about yourself was wrong and that the next 13 weeks were going to correct that misunderstanding. He was the drill sergeant. And the drill sergeant was, in the taxonomy of military training, a deliberately constructed phenomenon. Drill instructors are harsh on their troops initially in the first weeks of basic, as it is meant to break the recruits. As time wears on, they become somewhat of a father figure, and though they maintain their distance and harshness, the recruits become somewhat of a family. Break first. Build second. That was the theory. And the theory worked, which is why every military in the world has been using some version of it for centuries. You broke the civilian habits. The sleeping in, the talking back, the casual relationship with punctuality, the general assumption that your personal comfort was a relevant consideration in any given situation. You broke all of that away like plaster off a wall. And underneath the plaster, if the drill sergeant was doing his job correctly, you found the structure that was going to hold when everything else went wrong. Because in combat, everything goes wrong. In combat, your plan meets reality and the reality wins, and the only thing that keeps you moving in the right direction when the plan has dissolved and the smoke is thick and the noise is total is training that has been drilled so deep into your body that it operates below the level of conscious thought. You don't think about how to reload your rifle. Your hands do it while your eyes do something else. You don't think about taking cover. You're already moving. Once divisions passed their certification tests, they would often take part in Army-level maneuvers in vast areas in the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Louisiana. Some units would receive specialized training, desert warfare at the Desert Training Center in Southern California, Arizona, and Nevada, mountaineering skills at Camp Hale, Colorado, armor training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, airborne training at Fort Benning, Georgia. 13 weeks of basic, and then specialization, and then deployment. The whole pipeline, from civilian to combat-ready soldier, compressed into the shortest possible time that military science could manage without producing men who were more dangerous to themselves than the enemy. The Army was manufacturing human beings in bulk. And the product had to work. When you go through boot camp and they pass you, recalled Ben Quintana of Mississippi, you're ready to fight anything. Ready to fight anything. That's the aspiration. Whether you were ready or not was something you wouldn't fully know until the moment arrived. And by then, you were already in it. Let us now follow a single day. Not a battle day. Not a day that ends up in the history books. An ordinary day in the life of an ordinary soldier. Because the extraordinary days, the assaults and the ambushes and the moments that veterans still dream about 60 years later, those days were the exception. The ordinary day was the rule. And the ordinary day began the same way, in camp or at the front, in Europe or the Pacific, in a barracks or a foxhole. It began before dawn. The reveille bugle call was a feature of camp life that divided the world into two categories of people, the people that woke up and the people who were already awake and resented the reminder. Most soldiers woke up somewhere between 5 and 6 in the morning, though in forward positions near the front, the schedule was dictated less by bugles and more by the simple military necessity of standing to before first light. Standing to, the practice of every man at his post, alert, weapons ready, in the gray uncertain minutes before dawn, which was historically the time most favored for enemy attack. Dawn was not romantic in a foxhole. Dawn in a foxhole in Normandy or on a Pacific island was a slow, damp, cold emergence from the semi-consciousness of a few hours broken sleep into the full sensory assault of where you actually were. The smell hit you first. Mud, and wet wool, and cordite if there'd been firing the night before, and the particular intimate smell of men who have been living in close physical proximity without adequate access to bathing facilities for longer than any of them would care to admit. You became aware of your body second. The specific discomforts catalogued themselves as consciousness arrived. The cold in your feet. The ache in your shoulders from sleeping on ground that had no interest in conforming to human anatomy. The damp that had found its way through whatever waterproofing you had, because water, in the European theater especially, found its way through everything eventually. And then the sounds. Your sergeant's voice. Or the distant sound that might be artillery or might be thunder, and the difference mattered enormously. The sound of the man in the next foxhole beginning to stir. The sound of the camp coming alive in the organized, sequential way that military training had imposed on what would otherwise have been chaos. You were awake. You were a soldier. The day had started. Whether you were ready or not was, once again, not a question the day was going to wait for you to answer. Here is something that surprises most people when they think about it for the first time. The United States Army required its soldiers to shave. Every morning. In the field. At the front. Even in foxholes in the middle of active combat zones. The requirement did not bend for mud or cold or the general absence of running water or the philosophical argument that a man who might be dead by sunset perhaps had better uses for his morning minutes than standing in a line waiting his turn at a tin bowl of cold water. The Army did not accept these arguments. The Army had a position on shaving, and the position was that you would shave, and you would shave daily, and the reasons were not entirely about hygiene. They were about discipline. The same discipline that made you clean your weapon when you were exhausted. The same discipline that made you maintain your uniform when the uniform had been through 3 days of rain and it would have been considerably easier and more comfortable to just let it go. In camp, the morning routine had a recognizable shape. You rose. You dressed. In the barracks, this meant making your bunk to the specific, almost architectural standard the army required, sheets pulled tight enough that a coin bounced off them, pillow squared, blanket folded. This is the detail that always strikes civilians as absurd. Soldiers in training making their beds to standards precise enough to pass a geometry test. It seems like misplaced energy. It is not misplaced energy. It is the first decision of the day made correctly, under a standard, to a consistent result, regardless of how you felt about it. That habit of doing small things correctly and consistently, even when you don't want to and nobody would notice if you didn't, was the foundation on which everything else the army needed from you was built. Washing facilities in camp ranged from adequate to deeply inadequate. Hot water was a luxury that appeared and disappeared without predictability. Cold water was reliable but no one enjoyed it. Access to fresh supplies was usually very limited. Military cooks scrounged, bartered, traded, and substituted. Since food can have a huge impact on morale, the cooks did everything they could to keep everyone happy. The same entrepreneurial spirit that military cooks applied to food applied to every other aspect of soldier comfort. You improvised. You traded. You found ways to make inadequate circumstances marginally better by sheer force of human ingenuity and the particular creativity that scarcity generates. In the field, near the front, the morning hygiene routine was condensed to its essential elements. You shaved from your helmet, filling it with whatever water was available, using it as a basin, and performing the task with whatever efficiency and stoicism the temperature allowed. You cleaned your teeth with whatever remained in your tooth powder tin. You washed whatever could be washed in the time available. And then you were ready for inspection, which in the field took different forms than the parade ground precision of camp, but never disappeared entirely. The inspection. An officer or NCO moving down the line, looking at you, your bearing, your weapon, your equipment, your uniform, with the practiced eye of someone whose job was to maintain the physical and psychological discipline of the unit in conditions specifically designed to erode it. An inspection was not primarily about clean boots. It was about the statement that standards existed and would be maintained and that the chaos outside the wire had not reached inside it. That the army remained the army regardless of what the weather was doing or how long it had been since anyone slept properly. Some men resented it bitterly. Some men, over time, came to understand it in a way that surprised them. Because the structure, the routine, the inspection, the made bed and the shaved face, these were not trivial. In conditions designed to make everything feel random and meaningless and out of control, they were the architecture of a functioning mind. Now, let's talk about breakfast. Because the food situation in the United States Army during the Second World War was one of the most technically sophisticated and universally complained about achievements in the history of military logistics. The Army thought very hard about feeding its soldiers. It employed nutritionists and physiologists and food scientists. It ran tests. It consulted experts. It produced a system of field rations that represented, on paper, a genuine solution to the problem of how to feed millions of men in environments ranging from Alaskan cold to Pacific tropical heat, in conditions ranging from comfortable rear area camps to active combat positions where stopping to heat food was the kind of decision that could get you killed. The result was the K-ration. K-rations were invented by physiologist and Cell Keys from the University of Minnesota in 1941. The U.S. War Department was looking for a nutrition-heavy package that could last a long time in the field. They needed something that would keep troops healthy and wouldn't go bad. The boxes were dipped in wax so that when sealed, they'd be totally waterproof. The concept behind K-rations was simple, a daily ration of 3 meals, breakfast, dinner, and supper, that gives each soldier approximately 9,000 calories with 100 grams of protein. 9,000 calories. For context, modern nutritional guidelines suggest somewhere in the range of 2,000 calories per day for a reasonably active adult. A combat soldier needed 9,000. Because a combat soldier was carrying 30 to 60 pounds of equipment on foot across terrain that had been specifically designed, by geography or by the enemy, to be as difficult as possible to move through. He was cold. He was moving constantly. His body was burning fuel at a rate that would have seemed implausible in peacetime. The breakfast ration held canned ham or pork with eggs as well as biscuits and cereal bars. Instant coffee packets with sugar were also included. That's the official version. The version the laboratory designed, tested, and approved. Here is the field version, which is somewhat different in texture and in the emotional register of the men consuming it. One bummer was that the eggs in rations were powdered, which impacted the taste and texture. Powdered eggs. This product deserves a moment of quiet acknowledgement. Powdered eggs were technically eggs. They provided the nutritional content of eggs. They could be reconstituted with water and heated and served in the form of a substance that resembled scrambled eggs in the same way that a photograph of a beach resembles an actual beach. You could see what it was supposed to be. It smelled approximately correct. And when it arrived in your mess tin, pale and slightly rubbery, you ate it because you were hungry and because the alternative was not eating and there was a long day ahead of you. The C ration was often criticized for being repetitive and having a monotonous flavor profile. Monotonous. That word, in the official military report, doing extraordinary work. What it actually means is that men who ate the same combinations of canned meat and compressed biscuit and powdered beverage for weeks and months at a time began to experience their rations not as food but as a daily negotiation with their own willingness to continue. The food kept you alive. It did not, for the most part, make you feel that being alive was the sensory delight it might otherwise have seemed. McManus said soldiers especially hunted for eggs, refrigerated meat, and alcohol of any kind. But since locals often went hungry, it was difficult for soldiers to procure such ingredients. They hunted for fresh food. In the middle of a war. In foreign countries. Because nothing, not even an enemy machine gun position, was as motivating to a hungry young man as the knowledge that somewhere in the next village there might be real eggs and actual bread in something that had never been sealed in a wax-dipped box. This was not theft. It was not officially encouraged. It was the universal, constant, quietly universal practice of men who had been eating compressed pork from a can since October and had reached their personal limit. McManus sang the praises of the cooks who fed the soldiers under these conditions. Any semi-well-prepared, semi-hot meal could be a huge morale booster under these kind of circumstances, he said. Semi-hot. Semi-well-prepared. The bar had been recalibrated by necessity. In peacetime, warm food was a baseline expectation. In combat, warm food was a luxury that could shift the mood of an entire unit. A field kitchen producing hot coffee and something resembling stew in the cold Belgian winter of 1944 wasn't just providing calories. It was providing, however briefly, the sensation of being in a world where warmth existed and someone cared enough to provide it. That matters more than it sounds. In a context where everything is trying to kill you, a hot meal says, unambiguously, that the system is still functioning. That someone is still on your side. That you are, at least for the duration of a mess tin and a cup of instant coffee, not entirely alone in a hostile universe. Here is the thing about war that the movies consistently get wrong. The movies show the battles. They show the assaults and the retreats and the moments of individual heroism and collective catastrophe. They show the dramatic minutes that define the historical record. What the movies almost never show is the other 23 hours. The hours that were not dramatic. The hours that were, in their own grinding way, harder than the battles in some respects, because at least in a battle you knew what you were supposed to do. In the long, ordinary hours between battles, you were required to find ways to occupy yourself productively while remaining in a constant state of readiness for violence that might arrive at any moment or might not arrive for weeks. A soldier's day, away from active combat, was built around a structure of duties and assignments that was simultaneously purposeful and, to the men performing them, of wildly varying interest. Guard duty. Kitchen duty. Fatigue detail, the military's cheerful term for the kind of work that had to be done and nobody particularly wanted to do. Digging latrines. Moving supplies. Filling sandbags. Clearing fields of fire around a position. Maintaining communication lines. Cleaning, constantly cleaning, because the Army's relationship with cleanliness was both practical, dirty equipment fails at the worst possible moment, and philosophical. Soldiers practiced the same basic skills over and over, marching, loading, unloading, and cleaning their weapons. The weapon maintenance culture of the U.S. Army in the Second World War was, by the standards of the time, extremely sophisticated. Soldiers were required to know their weapon intimately, not just how to fire it but how to disassemble it completely, clean every component, identify wear and dysfunction, and reassemble it in conditions ranging from perfect workshop calm to near total darkness and extreme cold. This was not discretionary. A weapon that failed in combat was not an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence, and the Army took the training required to prevent that outcome very seriously indeed. Logistics and transportation were strong suits of the American Armed Forces. No other ground force in World War II was as mobile or as well supplied. All of that mobility and supply required constant human labor. Trucks needed maintaining. Roads needed repairing. Supply lines needed protecting and managing and extending. The enormous logistical machine that kept the frontline soldier supplied with ammunition and food and replacement equipment required hundreds of thousands of men doing unglamorous, essential work every single day. The men doing that work were soldiers. They had trained. They carried weapons. They were part of the Army. They were also, on any given day, digging a ditch or loading a truck or painting the roof of a supply depot, and the gap between that reality and the recruitment poster version of military service was something most of them processed with a combination of mild resentment and philosophical acceptance. You did your job. You did whatever job the Army decided your job was on that particular day. And if the job was glamorous, you were grateful, and if it wasn't, you did it anyway, because that's what a soldier did and there was, genuinely, no alternative. The human body was not designed to carry 60 pounds of equipment through mud for 12 hours at a time. This is not a controversial biological statement. It is simply the physical reality that infantry soldiers in every war in human history have had to negotiate between the body they had and the demands being placed on it. The march was the infantry's basic unit of movement. Before mechanized transport, armies moved on foot. During the Second World War, armies moved in trucks and half-tracks and jeeps when trucks and half-tracks and jeeps were available, which was frequently, because the U.S. Army was better mechanized than almost any other fighting force on Earth. But even the most mechanized army in history still had moments when the vehicles were gone or the road was impassable or the tactical situation required you to get somewhere that wheels couldn't reach. And then you walked. You walked with your rifle and your pack and your ammunition and your rations and your entrenching tool and your gas mask and your canteen and whatever additional equipment your particular specialty required. The standard infantry load in the Second World War was somewhere between 30 and 60 pounds depending on the mission and the theater. In the Pacific, in jungle terrain, where every extra pound translated to additional exhaustion and additional sweat and additional risk of heat exhaustion, that weight was managed with constant calculation and occasional resentment. In the European winter, where warmth was survival, you added layers and blankets and the weight went up accordingly. They were young. Most of them were very young. 18 and 19-year-old bodies, which have a remarkable capacity for absorbing punishment and then getting up and doing it again the next day. The physical resilience of the young infantryman was one of the Army's most reliable assets. The body at 19 recovers from exhaustion in ways that the body at 30 cannot match. Blisters that would have kept a civilian in bed for a week were wrapped and walked on. Muscles that screamed in the first days of basic training adapted within weeks to loads that would have seemed impossible at the start. But even young bodies had limits. And the march tested those limits repeatedly and without sentimentality. You marched until you couldn't, and then you found that you could a little more, and then a little more beyond that. Drill instructors used tough methods to force the newcomers to become attentive to detail and protocol. Attention to detail in physical training, maintaining your form when your legs were gone, keeping your spacing in the column when you wanted nothing more than to stop and sit down, these were not minor details. They were, potentially, the difference between a unit that held together under fire and one that collapsed into individuals when the pressure became too great. You marched and drilled and trained. And then you did it again. And the resentment you felt in the first weeks became something else in the later months. Not enthusiasm, but a kind of grim recognition that the body you had now, the body that had been through this training, was a fundamentally different instrument than the body that arrived at boot camp. Stronger. More efficient. More obedient to the will when the will said move and every muscle said no. You were not the same person who had stood in that recruitment line. Not physically. Not in any sense that mattered. The relationship between a soldier and his rifle was one of the defining relationships of his military life. This sounds like metaphor. It was not metaphor. A soldier's rifle was not an object he carried. It was, in the most practical possible sense, the thing that kept him alive. In the training camps and in the field, the Army's message on weapon maintenance was consistent, repetitive, and non-negotiable. Your rifle was your responsibility. Its condition was your responsibility. If it failed in combat because you had failed to clean it, that failure was yours in the most direct and consequential sense imaginable. Following commands, they practiced the same basic skills over and over, marching, loading, unloading, and cleaning their weapons. The standard U.S. Army rifle in the Second World War was the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that was, by the standards of the time, a genuinely excellent weapon. GIs would deploy overseas with newly designed and produced equipment, some excellent models, and some that were at a significant disadvantage to German equivalents. The Garand was one of the excellent models. It was reliable, accurate, and comparatively easy to maintain. But comparatively easy is not the same as easy, and maintaining it in conditions of mud and sand and rain and cold required consistent, daily attention. Strip the rifle down. Clean every component. The barrel, the action, the bolt, the trigger group. Oil what needed oiling, not too much because excess oil attracted dirt and dirt caused jams and jams caused the kind of problem you really did not want to be having at the particular moment when having a problem was most dangerous. Reassemble. Function check. Do it again tomorrow. Equipment care extended beyond the rifle. Everything a soldier carried had a maintenance requirement. Boots needed waterproofing. The entrenching tool, the folding shovel that could mean the difference between being sheltered and being exposed in a fire fight, needed its blade kept serviceable. The canteen needed cleaning. The mess kit needed cleaning. The gas mask needed inspection. The uniform needed attention to the extent that attention was possible, which in the field was often not very much, but some attempt had to be made. The accessory packet included 9 cigarettes, water purification tablets, salt tablets to prevent heat exhaustion, matches, toilet paper, chewing gum, and a can opener. Those water purification tablets. A detail worth pausing on, because what they represent is the Army's recognition that the water a soldier found in the field, river water, well water, water from sources of unspecified character in countries where the infrastructure had been comprehensively destroyed by several years of active war, was not reliably safe to drink. You purified your water or you risked dysentery, which would take you out of the fight as efficiently as a bullet and was considerably less heroic. Equipment care, at its core, was the physical practice of keeping yourself in the fight. Every piece of equipment you maintained correctly was one fewer way the war could kill you by means other than the obvious one. The soldier who maintained his equipment carefully was not being fussy. He was being rational. He was doing the thing that a person who expected to survive would do, and doing it every day, regardless of exhaustion or weather or the general invitation to stop caring that prolonged discomfort eventually extended to every man in the field. Where a soldier slept told you a great deal about where he was in the war and what the war was currently asking of him. In training camp, you slept in barracks. The barracks was a long wooden building full of double-stacked iron bunks, each one separated from its neighbor by approximately 3 feet of air, which was enough space to provide the theoretical privacy of your own bunk but not enough to prevent you from knowing, with intimate and unwanted familiarity, the sleeping habits of the 12 men on either side of you. Who snored, and how dramatically? Who talked in his sleep? Who woke at 3 in the morning with nightmares that he didn't yet know were nightmares because nothing had happened yet to put material in them? The barracks was noisy, perpetually slightly too warm or too cold, and smelled of the particular blend of male proximity and industrial cleaning product that was, for millions of men in this period, the permanent olfactory backdrop to their military experience. You got used to it. You got used to it the way you got used to the food and the schedule and the constant presence of other people and the almost total absence of anything you could genuinely call private time. You adapted, or you found it very difficult indeed. In the field, forward of the relatively comfortable infrastructure of the rear, the accommodation situation deteriorated in direct proportion to your proximity to the enemy. First you went from barracks to tents. Large canvas tents, staked out in orderly rows in the fields and forests behind the lines, heated by small stoves in the European theater or offering the paradoxical shelter of shade and wind protection in the Pacific. Tents were not comfortable. They were considerably more comfortable than what came next. What came next was the foxhole. The foxhole was the infantryman's basic home in combat. A hole in the earth, dug by the soldier himself with the entrenching tool he carried, approximately deep enough to shelter his body below ground level when incoming fire was arriving horizontally. 2 feet deep was better than 1 foot. 3 feet deep was better than 2. In the ideal version, you shared your foxhole with one other soldier so that one man could sleep while the other watched. In the actual version, conditions varied enormously. Digging a foxhole sounds like a straightforward task until you consider the range of conditions under which it had to be performed. In frozen ground in the Ardennes in December 1944, the ground was as hard as concrete and a soldier's entrenching tool made approximately the impact on it that a spoon makes on a sidewalk. Men chipped at the frozen earth for hours to produce shelter that was never quite adequate and always essential. In the coral of Pacific Island beaches, digging was again nearly impossible, and the alternatives, natural cover, whatever rubble the fighting had produced, were used with desperate creativity. In the mud of Normandy, the problem went in the other direction. You dug your hole and the water table filled it before you finished digging it. During the Battle of the Bulge, soldiers faced artillery barrages while cowering in dugouts. Combat-induced mental and emotional breakdowns like this have always been a part of war. A foxhole in an artillery barrage. Let us sit with that image for a moment. You are in a hole you dug yourself, roughly 3 feet deep, with perhaps a foot of sandbag or wood on the rim. The shells are landing within meters. Each one produces a concussion you feel not just in your ears but in your chest, your teeth, your sinuses. The sound is beyond loud. It is something else. A physical force that reorganizes your nervous system whether you want it to or not. And your entire job, your only available action, is to be as small as possible at the bottom of your hole and wait for it to stop. That was where the soldier lived. That was home. The power that a simple letter had upon the morale of one in service is incomprehensible. In an age when immediate contact was impossible, waiting on the mail was a constant preoccupation. Mail call. 2 words that functioned in the combat soldier's psychological landscape as a combination of anticipated pleasure, desperate hope, and the particular vulnerability of caring very much about something you had no control over. Twice a day, usually, in rear areas. Less frequently near the front. Sometimes not at all for weeks, because the logistics of delivering personal mail to men in active combat were genuinely complicated and sometimes simply impossible. Soldiers and sailors who suffered through prolonged waiting for mail often felt anxious and lonely for home. In 1945 alone, nearly 3 billion pieces of mail were exchanged between service members and the friends and family who supported them on the home front. The mail call was one of the most cherished rituals of soldiers and sailors serving abroad. 3 billion. In a single year. That number contains multitudes. It contains every piece of paper on which someone sat at a kitchen table in Ohio and tried to describe what the weather was doing and how the garden was coming along and whether the cat was still bringing in dead birds, all of it carefully calibrated to convey the message underneath the message, which was simply, "I am here, I am thinking of you, the world you left still exists and is waiting for you. First you opened it, and if you were like most soldiers, you had a special way of opening a letter. You didn't rip it open, you went about it slowly, savoring every happy moment of it. You looked the outside over, slowly reading the postmark, the return address, noticing the color of the ink and the exact style of handwriting, and wondering just what was inside. That deliberateness. That conscious extension of the pleasure of anticipation. A letter from home was a finite resource. When you'd read it, it was read, and the next one might not come for days or weeks. So you read slowly. You made it last. You folded it back into its envelope and you kept it, and on the bad days, the days when everything was wrong and the world had narrowed down to cold and fear and the absence of everything you loved, you took it out and read it again. Soldier Worth K. Baird wrote in his diary, "Her letters do so much to pick me up. It's just like a new spark of life. She's a sweet wife. No mail again. This mail situation is getting terrible. No one on the rock is getting mail. The weather has cleared too. Must be a big movement going on somewhere. No mail again." Read those 3 words and understand them completely. No mail again, for a man who had been on an island in the Pacific for months, who hadn't held his wife's hand since he left home, who had no telephone and no telegram and no communication of any kind with the people he loved except these paper rectangles that crossed 12,000 miles of ocean to find him. No mail again was not a minor disappointment. It was an isolation so complete that it had its own physical weight. When referring to the importance of mail delivery during World War II, Postmaster General Frank C. Walker remarked, "It is almost impossible to overstress the importance of this mail. It is so essential to morale that Army and Navy officers of the highest rank list mail almost on a level with munitions and food. On a level with munitions and food." A senior American official, in a formal statement, placing the emotional sustenance provided by a letter from home in the same category as bullets and breakfast. And he was right. Not metaphorically right. Practically right. Because a soldier without ammunition couldn't fight. A soldier without food couldn't function. And a soldier who had been cut off from every human connection for long enough began to lose the thing that made him willing to do any of this in the first place. No account of what it was actually like to be a soldier in the Second World War can ignore the thing that kept most of them sane. Not the mail, though the mail was essential. Not the rations, though the rations kept them moving. Not the leadership, though good leadership mattered enormously. The thing that kept most of them sane was each other. The friendships forged in combat have a specific quality that civilians struggle to fully understand and that veterans struggle to fully articulate. They were not chosen friendships. You did not select your foxhole companion based on shared interests or compatible personalities. You were assigned to a unit and the unit was your world, and the men in it became, by force of shared experience and proximity and danger, the closest relationships of your life. Men who would, in peacetime, never have encountered each other, a farm boy from Arkansas and a jazz musician from Harlem and an Italian-American kid from New Jersey and a second-generation Norwegian from Minnesota, were sleeping in the same dirt, eating the same food, covering the same ground, and discovering that the things they had in common were more durable than the things that separated them. Because of its scale, no war inspired more new slang than World War II. Thousands of new words and phrases were birthed during the Big One, and getting acquainted with them offers a fascinating and often humorous soldier's eye view of the conflict. The slang was its own culture, its own literature almost. A bunk lizard was a lazy soldier with a sloth-like attraction to his bed. Chicken berry meant an egg. Completely cheesed meant bored to an extreme. Canned morale was a movie. Collision mats were pancakes or waffles. Chicken shit was the GI's name for service regulations and the seemingly endless make-work chores. That last one. Chicken shit. An entire category of military life, the bureaucratic, the petty, the regulatory, the make-work that was imposed from above and served primarily to remind you that the institution you were part of had an infinite capacity for administrative creativity, Compressed into 2 words that every soldier understood immediately and used constantly, and that somehow managed to carry both contempt and affection in equal measure. Because here is the thing about the humor. It wasn't simply entertainment. It was a psychological technology. A chairborne infantry was a desk worker. A coffee cooler was one who seeks easy jobs, a loafer. A chow hound was a man who always wound up at the head of the mess line. The humor named and thereby domesticated the absurdities and indignities of military life. It took the grinding, the unfair, the scary, and the maddening, and turned them into material. Into stories. Into the kind of shared references that built a culture. An army is not just an organization. It is a culture with its own language, its own humor, its own heroes and villains and legends and jokes. The soldiers of the Second World War created that culture as they went, adding to it daily from the raw material of their experience, and the culture that resulted was one of the things that held the whole enterprise together when the official structures and the formal command relationships were under strain. Here is the honest, unglamorous, mostly unfilmed truth about combat in the Second World War. For most soldiers, on most days, the war was not exciting. It was boring. Genuinely, profoundly, stubbornly boring. Long periods of waiting interrupted by shorter periods of terror, and the waiting was, in its own way, as corrosive as the terror. You waited for orders. You waited for the weather to change. You waited for supplies to arrive. You waited for the command to advance, which didn't come. You waited in positions you'd been holding for days or weeks, the same ground, the same view, the same routine, the same rations, the same faces, the same conversations that had already been had so many times that everyone knew how each one ended before it began. The army knew about boredom. The army had, in fact, a formal position on boredom, which was that it was dangerous. A bored soldier was an unpredictable soldier. A bored soldier found ways to entertain himself that weren't always consistent with good order and military discipline. A bored soldier started thinking, about home, about why he was here, about whether the whole thing was going to end and if so when and in what condition he would be when it did. So the army provided entertainment. Canned morale movies were screened in rear areas and at USO shows. Bob Hope was already famous before the war. During the war he became something else. He became a symbol of the fact that the world that had sent these men away still knew they existed and was making an effort to reach them. The USO tour wasn't just entertainment. It was a statement. Cards were played. Dice were rolled. Money changed hands in games of chance that would not have been officially sanctioned by the commanding officer and were conducted with the open complicity of the same commanding officer who had just walked past the game 3 times without appearing to notice it. Because everyone understood that the game was not the point. The game was the activity that produced conversation and competition and the comfortable rhythms of social engagement. The game was the thing that made the time between the waiting and the next waiting feel like something you were doing rather than something being done to you. Writing letters was both communication and occupation. Cleaning your equipment when it was already clean was therapy with a practical justification. Reading whatever was available, paperback novels, local newspapers obtained by unclear means, the contents of care packages from home that included books as often as food, was both entertainment and a kind of daily reminder that the world contained things other than military operations. The boredom was underrated as a challenge. It didn't kill you. It didn't appear in the casualty statistics. But it wore at you in ways that were real and cumulative and that the Army's cheerful provision of movies and USO shows could only partially address. Because the boredom wasn't really about having nothing to do. It was about being far from home, and uncertain about the future, and unable to control any of the factors that were going to determine what that future looked like. You couldn't end the war by wishing it. You couldn't accelerate the command decision that would send you somewhere or stop you or deploy you or pull you back. You could only wait. And the waiting, when you let yourself feel it fully, was almost as hard as anything else. Sleep in a combat zone was not sleep as you understood the word in peacetime. It was something more functional and less restorative. A form of maintenance that the body performed on itself because it had no choice, fitted into whatever gaps the operational schedule, the noise, the anxiety, and the basic physical discomfort of your current accommodation allowed. In camp, in barracks, sleep was at least structurally possible. You had a bunk. You had a blanket. The lights went out at a specific time and the building was, relative to a foxhole, quiet. The sleep you got in barracks was still broken by the institutional sounds of a building full of men, the midnight bathroom visits, the sleepwalkers, the dreamers, the man in the far corner whose snoring had become so famous in the unit that it had acquired a nickname, but it was sleep. It happened. You woke up feeling, if not fully rested, at least partially recharged. In the field, the sleep situation deteriorated with each step toward the front. In bivouac behind the lines, you slept in a tent or under a shelter half a tent, shared with another soldier, pegged into the ground wherever the ground was available. It was cold, usually. It was damp, frequently. The ground was hard and uneven and had a particular talent for finding and pressing against whichever part of your body you most needed to protect. You slept in your clothes. You slept with your rifle within reach. You slept knowing that the man next to you was also awake some of the time, also listening to the same sounds, also running the same mental calculations about which sounds were routine and which represented something requiring immediate response. In a forward position, in a foxhole, sleep was reduced to its bare minimum. You slept in shifts with your foxhole partner, one of you alert while the other allowed whatever combination of physical and mental exhaustion had accumulated over the preceding hours to temporarily overwhelm consciousness. It was rarely more than 2 or 3 hours at a time. The dreams were their own particular problem. The brain, in sleep, processed what it had experienced, and what it had experienced during the day didn't always arrange itself into narratives that left you feeling better when you woke up. Veterans describe specific dreams with a precision that suggests they were more vivid than ordinary dreams. Hyperreal. Total. Not symbolic or surreal but simply a replay of a moment, seen again from the same angle, with the same sounds and the same smells and the same impossible choices, except this time there was no action to take because you were dreaming and your body was lying in a hole in the ground in France or Guadalcanal and the part of your brain that ran the dream didn't have the architecture yet to turn the experience into something safe to revisit. You slept because you had to. You woke up because it was time to wake up. And you carried whatever the night had given you into the next day, and you performed the day's duties with it sitting somewhere in your chest, and you didn't mention it because you didn't have the language yet and because neither did anyone else. No theater of war in the Second World War was comfortable. This is worth stating plainly because the instinct is to think that the difference between Europe and the Pacific was primarily cultural and tactical. It was also climatic, and the climate was not a background condition. It was an active participant in the daily life of every soldier in every theater. In the European theater, the mud of autumn and winter was legendary. GIs deployed overseas faced an enormous range of environmental challenges. The mud of Normandy in the autumn of 1944. The mud of Belgium in the winter of the Ardennes offensive. A specific kind of mud, thick, adhesive, cold, with an almost malicious intelligence for finding the gap between a boot and a pant leg, for filling foxholes, for rendering every road a negotiation and every movement a physical ordeal. Soldiers in the European theater in winter carried the mud everywhere. It was on their boots and their clothes and their hands and eventually their faces. It was in their food. It was a constant, daily, grinding physical reality that no amount of training had quite prepared them for. Trench foot. A condition that sounds almost comical in its name and was in practice deeply serious. Chronic fatigue states were characterized by symptoms like dysentery, insomnia, memory defects, and a general sense of hopelessness. Wet feet plus cold temperatures plus long periods of immobility, standing guard in water-filled foxholes, marching through soaked terrain, produced a progressive tissue damage that began as numbness and ended, in serious cases, with the kind of infection that required hospitalization. The army lectured soldiers extensively on foot care. The soldiers, who were busy fighting a war, did their best. In the Pacific, the discomforts ran in different directions. The heat was primary. A wet heat, in jungle terrain, that sat on you like a physical weight from before sunrise to long after dark, that soaked your uniform within minutes of putting it on, that made every physical effort exponentially harder than it would have been in temperate conditions. Men lost 5 or more pounds of water weight per day in the jungle and had to be constantly, vigilantly rehydrated or they stopped functioning. And then the insects. The mosquitoes of the Pacific Theater were not the mild annoyance of a summer evening in a domestic garden. They were a public health crisis in entomological form. Malaria was endemic across the Pacific Island chain. 1 out of every 4 casualties in World War II was attributed to combat fatigue, but disease casualties, particularly in the Pacific, were equally significant. The Army had malaria suppression tablets, atabrine, that turned a soldier's skin slightly yellow and had side effects that were not entirely beloved by the men who took them, but which kept malaria at a manageable rather than catastrophic level. Dengue fever. Jungle rot, the fungal infections that established themselves in any skin that remained wet and warm long enough, which in the Pacific jungle was any skin. Leeches. Centipedes. Snakes encountered in the dark. None of this appeared in the recruitment poster. All of it appeared in the daily experience of the soldier in the field. You got hurt, in the Second World War, in ways that had nothing to do with the enemy. This is one of the persistent features of military history that tends to surprise people. The ratio of disease casualties to combat casualties in most wars, through most of history, had been unfavorably skewed toward disease. In previous centuries, armies were often destroyed more completely by epidemic illness than by opposing forces. The Second World War improved on this historical average considerably, largely due to the advances in medical science, logistics, and military hygiene that had been developing since the catastrophe of the First World War. Some 40% of all the medical discharges in World War II were for psychiatric reasons, the so-called Section 8s. That number tells you about the psychiatric toll. The medical toll, the physical injuries and illnesses that had nothing to do with combat, was separately enormous. Dysentery was universal. In any environment where large numbers of men were living in close proximity with inadequate sanitation, which described virtually every forward position in every theater, the bacteria that caused dysentery found their opportunity and took it. Veterans in these environments often displayed chronic fatigue states, characterized by symptoms like dysentery, insomnia, memory defects, and a general sense of hopelessness. A soldier with dysentery was a soldier who was losing fluids faster than he could replace them, who was physically weakened in direct proportion to the severity and duration of the illness, and who was conducting his daily military duties while managing a level of physical distress that in peacetime would have sent him directly to bed. Frostbite in the European winter. Heat exhaustion in the Pacific summer. Fungal infections. Respiratory infections. The ordinary illnesses of human life, colds, fevers, headaches, muscle injuries, all continued to occur in the field, as they had always occurred, with the additional complication that you couldn't take a day off because you were unwell in the modern civilian sense. The medic was one of the most important people in any combat unit. Training the medics, who were often positioned close to the front line, was a specific and essential part of the Army's medical preparation. The combat medic's job was to provide immediate treatment, stopping bleeding, treating shock, managing wounds and fractures, in conditions where the nearest hospital was miles away, and getting the casualty there was itself a tactical operation. They were respected with an intensity that veterans describe with a consistency that amounts to something very close to reverence. The man who came to you when you were down, in the open, under fire, was performing an act of courage so particular and so practical that it occupied its own category. The United States Army paid its soldiers. Not generously, by civilian standards of the time, but it paid them consistently, and there was, in a combat zone, almost nothing to spend the money on, which meant that most soldiers had a slow accumulation of pay that was either sent home to their families or held against the theoretical possibility of leave. A private in the U.S. Army in the Second World War earned $50 per month. That's approximately equivalent, in modern purchasing power, to around $900. For $50 a month, you trained, deployed, lived in a foxhole, ate powdered eggs, and if necessary advanced toward an enemy position under fire. The financial compensation was not the reason most men were there. Leave. The word itself had a kind of compressed magic in the vocabulary of the soldier. Cit meant a civilian, from citizen. Civis meant civilian clothing. The word soldiers used for civilian life had a kind of archaeological quality, remnants of a world you'd come from and weren't sure when you'd see again. Leave was the temporary re-entry into that world. A pass, a weekend in a city behind the lines. The ability to sleep in a real bed, eat food in a restaurant, walk streets that weren't controlled by military schedules. In practice, leave was irregular, inconsistently distributed, and never long enough. The further forward you were, the less leave was available. The more intense the operational tempo, the longer between passes. Men went months without any official time off whatsoever and managed this absence of downtime with varying degrees of success and increasingly sophisticated complaining. When leave did come, soldiers used it with the particular intensity of people who knew it was temporary. Burn and turn, blackjack. Cooking with gas, succeeding, doing well. The slang of off-duty soldiers was the slang of people determined to enjoy the hours available to them. They found music and bars and the company of people who weren't also soldiers and who didn't know what you knew and hadn't seen what you'd seen and were, by virtue of that ignorance, wonderfully easy to be around for a few hours. You could be, briefly, an ordinary person in an ordinary place. You could forget, incompletely but usefully, what your ordinary life now actually consisted of. And then the leave was over, and you went back. Here is the thing they didn't put in the recruitment posters. Here is the thing that the newsreels and the morale films and the newspaper coverage consistently underemphasized, not from malice but from a combination of genuine uncertainty, official caution, and the basic human reluctance to contemplate too closely what it does to a mind to be subjected, over long periods, to mortal danger. Fear. In one survey of combat veterans in the European theater of operations, fully 65% admitted to having at least one episode during combat in which they felt incapacitated and unable to perform because of extreme fear. 65%. Nearly 2 out of every 3 combat veterans admitted to having been, at some point, physically unable to function due to fear. Not nervousness. Not anxiety in the manageable modern therapeutic sense. Incapacitated. Unable to move, unable to think clearly, reduced by the body's own emergency systems to a state in which the primitive survival instinct had overridden everything else. After the Guadalcanal campaign, the U.S. military learned that a serviceman's ability to survive the psychological rigors of combat could not be predicted. According to one team of Army psychiatrists, most men could tolerate only about 180 days in combat before their fighting effectiveness diminished. 180 days. 6 months. That was the approximate human limit, the point at which the accumulated stress of sustained combat began to permanently degrade the capacity of even the most resilient, best trained, most motivated soldier to continue functioning at an acceptable level. In World War II it was determined by the U.S. Army that the time it took for a soldier to experience combat fatigue while fighting on the front lines was somewhere between 60 and 240 days, depending on the intensity and frequency of combat. Combat fatigue. What had been known in previous wars as nostalgia, old sergeant's disease, or shell shock, was now appropriately termed combat fatigue. In past wars and in the opening days of World War II, the War Department believed that soldiers suffering from combat fatigue had an underlying, pre-existing mental condition. They believed it was weakness. They believed that the men who broke were men who had always been, at some fundamental level, breakable. They were wrong. And the evidence that they were wrong arrived with such volume and consistency from every theater of operation that even the most resistant institutional position had to eventually concede the point. By that time, most psychiatrists understood that any soldier could suffer a mental collapse. Any soldier. Not the weak ones. Not the poorly trained or the cowardly or the constitutionally fragile. Any soldier, given enough time and close enough contact with enough violence and enough noise and enough death and enough of the particular terror of artillery, which came from nowhere, gave no warning, and could not be fought back against, would eventually reach the point where the human nervous system, which was simply not designed for this, could not continue. Overall, 1,393,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen were treated for combat fatigue in World War II. On Okinawa alone, 26,000 psychiatric casualties were documented. 1.5 million men treated for the psychological consequences of what they had been through. And those were the ones who were treated. The ones whose symptoms were severe enough to require formal medical intervention. Behind those 1.5 million were millions more who carried what they carried home with them, folded away in the same place they kept the letters they'd received during the war, and who found in the years after the fighting ended that the things they thought they'd left behind in France or the Pacific had, in fact, followed them home. They called it the 1,000-yard stare. A U.S. Marine exhibits a 1,000-yard stare during World War II, an unfocused, despondent, and weary gaze which is a frequent manifestation of combat fatigue. You see it in photographs from every theater. The eyes that are open but pointed somewhere the camera can't reach. Somewhere past the frame. Past the war, possibly. Past anything currently visible. A man looking at something only he can see, and whatever it is, he's not going to tell you what it is. The day ended the same way it began. In the dark. In camp, lights out was an official event. The bugle, or the command, or simply the time on the watch that meant you were supposed to be in your bunk and quiet. The day's duties completed, the evening's brief entertainments concluded, the last letters written or received and folded away. The building settling into the sounds of mass sleep, the breathing, the shifting, the dreams spoken aloud or kept silent. In the field, the end of the day was less defined. There was no official quiet moment when a soldier at the front could say, "That's it, the day is done, I can rest." The front didn't recognize the end of the day as a relevant category. The front was the front at midnight as completely as it was at noon. The guard rotation continued. The watch continued. Somewhere in the enemy lines, other men in other holes were also awake and also exhausted and also listening. You wrote your letter if you hadn't written it yet. You ate whatever the evening had provided. You cleaned your weapon one more time, the rhythm of it automatic by now, your hands moving without conscious direction while your mind was somewhere else. You talked with the man next to you, about nothing important, about what you'd eat first when you got home, about whether the Cardinals were going to have a good season, about the woman in the last town who had looked at you a certain way, and the conversation was not about its content. The conversation was the warmth of another human voice in the dark, reminding you that you were not alone in this hole, in this night, in this particular corner of a war that had already gone on longer than you'd believed it would when you signed your name on that form in the recruitment office in a town that felt like it existed in a different life entirely. And then you slept, or tried to. Your partner on watch at the edge of the foxhole, his silhouette just visible against the slightly less dark sky. The sounds of the night around you, catalogued and assessed and filed away as non-threatening or otherwise. Your rifle within reach. Your letter from home folded in your chest pocket, close to whatever part of you was still the person who had received it. Tomorrow the bugle would sound, or the sergeant's voice would arrive, or the light would simply change and you would wake up before anything told you to because your body knew the schedule now, better than your mind did. And you would rise in the gray pre-dawn and shave from your helmet and eat your breakfast from a wax-dipped box and clean your weapon and do your duties and wait and march and wait and talk to the men around you and wait again. When you go through boot camp and they pass you, you're ready to fight anything. He was right. And also, in the way that only someone who'd been through it could understand, not quite right. Because there were things training couldn't prepare you for. Not completely. Not the specific weight of the silence after a barrage stopped. Not the specific way time moved in a firefight, expanding and contracting in ways that had nothing to do with clocks. Not the specific feeling of having been afraid in a particular way for a particular stretch of time and then discovering that the fear had left a mark, somewhere, that wasn't going away when the fear did. He was a soldier. He was 19 or 20 or 25. He was from Ohio or Georgia or Brooklyn or a farm outside of somewhere in Mississippi that he probably thought about more now than he ever did when he lived there. He was extraordinary in the way that ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things are extraordinary, which is to say completely and without fanfare and without anyone to write it down most of the time. He ate powdered eggs and cleaned his rifle and wrote letters home and waited in foxholes and carried his fear with a dignity that the recruitment posters never found a way to capture. Before we go any further tonight, let's ask ourselves a question that seems simple on the surface and turns out to be anything but. How do you hold a war together? Not the tactical question. Not the strategic one. Not the question of how you move a division or coordinate an air campaign or keep the supply lines open across 5,000 miles of hostile ocean. The deeper question. The human question. How do you keep 8 million men, scattered across every continent, every ocean, every climate zone on Earth, separated from every person they love and everything familiar, performing dangerous and exhausting and often genuinely terrifying work, day after day, month after month, for years? How do you keep those men functional? How do you keep them going? Part of the answer was training. Part was leadership. Part was unit cohesion, the bonds that formed between men who shared foxholes and rations and fear. Part was the institutional discipline that gave structure to days that would otherwise have collapsed into chaos. But there was something else. Something the generals knew about. Something the Postmaster General of the United States, in a formal statement in 1942, placed on the same level of operational importance as ammunition and food. Something that crossed 12,000 miles of ocean on rolls of microfilm and arrived, slightly smaller than it had been sent, in the hands of a young man in a foxhole in the Pacific who read it so many times the paper went soft at the folds. A letter from home. The United States Postmaster General, writing in 1942, argued that frequent and rapid communication with parents, associates, and other loved ones strengthens fortitude, enlivens patriotism, makes loneliness endurable, and inspires to even greater devotion the men and women who are carrying on our fight far from home and from friends. That is an extraordinary sentence. Read it again and hear what it's actually saying. Not that mail was nice. Not that soldiers appreciated letters. That mail was a strategic instrument of war. That it strengthened fighting capacity. That it inspired devotion. That it made loneliness endurable, which is a very specific and very important phrase, because loneliness in a combat zone wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was an active threat to the psychological integrity of the fighting force. In the words of the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion's motto, no mail, low morale. 4 words. The entire emotional mathematics of military mail, compressed to 4 words by the women of the 6,888th, the all-black, all-female postal unit whose job it was to sort and direct the staggering backlog of military mail in the European theater, a backlog that had piled up in warehouses in Birmingham, England, until there were millions of pieces of correspondence that nobody could find the recipient for because the army had moved and the addresses were wrong and the whole system had quietly buckled under its own weight. They fixed it. Hundreds of thousands of pieces of mail that had been sitting in warehouses for months, found and sorted and delivered. Letters that soldiers had given up on ever receiving, arriving years after they were sent. But that story belongs a little later. First, let us go back to the beginning. To the moment the system had to be built from nothing, for a scale of correspondence that the world had never seen before. In 1939, before America had entered the war, before the draft had reached into the lives of the young men who would become the 8 million, the question of how to keep a wartime fighting force connected to the civilian world it had come from hadn't yet become urgent. It was a theoretical concern. A planning problem sitting somewhere on a list of planning problems that the War Department would get to eventually. And then December 7, 1941 happened. And the scale of what was about to be required became suddenly, comprehensively clear. 86 million Axis and Allied military personnel were activated during World War II. 86 million. Most of them had families. Most of them had mothers and fathers and sweethearts and wives and children. Most of them, in the long stretches between the violent moments that defined their public history, were thinking about those people with an intensity that combat did nothing to diminish and in many ways sharpened. Because in the face of the possibility of death, the people you loved became more vivid, not less. More present, not more remote. More important, precisely because there was a genuine possibility that you would not see them again. The letter was the only instrument available for managing that reality. There was no telephone service to the front lines of Normandy or the jungles of Guadalcanal. There was no telegram exchange that could carry the daily texture of ordinary life across an ocean. There was only paper and ink and the deliberate act of sitting down, in whatever time and space was available, and translating what you felt and thought and needed to say into words on a page that would then begin a journey of weeks or months through a logistical system of almost incomprehensible complexity to arrive at the person you most needed to reach. In 1945 alone, 2.5 billion pieces went through the Army Postal Service and 8 million pieces through Navy post offices. 2.5 billion pieces of mail. In a single year. From a country with a total population of approximately 140 million people. The mathematics of that, when you sit with them, are genuinely staggering. It means that virtually every family in America was in active, ongoing correspondence with someone in uniform overseas. It means that the connection between the home front and the fighting front was not metaphorical. It was physical. It was 2.5 billion physical pieces of paper traveling the globe in the hands of military postal workers who understood, with absolute clarity, that what they were moving was not just correspondence. The mail itself is a very popular topic of correspondence, nearly every letter either promising to write soon or begging the recipient to write more often. That detail captures something essential. The letters were about the mail. Soldiers wrote to say they hadn't heard and asking why, asking for more, promising to write more themselves, acknowledging letters received with the specific gratitude of someone who had been waiting and finally been reached. The correspondence was self-referential in the way that all human communication under stress becomes self-referential. The medium itself becomes the message because the act of communication is the thing that matters most, even before the content of what is being communicated. You wrote because writing was the only action available. You were in France. She was in Ohio. You could not hold her hand or sit at her kitchen table or hear her voice. You could put words on paper. So you put words on paper. And you were careful about the words because you knew an officer was going to read them before they left camp. And you were careful about the words because you didn't want her to worry. And you were careful about the words because there were things you had seen that you couldn't write down because putting them in writing made them more real than you were currently able to afford for them to be. Strict censorship governed the letters servicemen sent home from overseas, and the men sometimes chafed under its restrictions. But they also censored themselves, careful to keep from worrying their loved ones back home. The self-censorship. That is the layer that the official censors never saw and that the letters themselves only partially reveal. A man who had watched his closest friend die in a field in Belgium wrote home to his mother and described the weather and said he was fine and asked about the dog. Not because he had nothing to say. Because he had everything to say and none of it was something he could put in a letter to his mother without dismantling whatever peace of mind she had managed to construct for herself in the months since he left. So he wrote about the weather. He said he was fine. He asked about the dog. And she read it at her kitchen table and was grateful and worried anyway and wrote back immediately to say she was glad he was fine and the dog missed him and the garden was coming along, and inside every line of her ordinary letter was the thing that was really being said, which was, "I love you and I am so afraid and please come home." Before we can understand the V-mail system, we have to understand the problem it was designed to solve. Because the problem was genuinely serious, and it arrived faster than anyone had been fully prepared for. The problem was weight. Physical weight. The weight of 2.5 billion pieces of paper per year, needing to be transported across oceans that were being actively contested by enemy submarines, in cargo ships that were already carrying everything required to sustain a global military operation. Weapons. Food. Fuel. Ammunition. Medical supplies. Spare parts for vehicles and aircraft. The logistical demand on Allied shipping was total and continuous, and every mail sack that went into a cargo hold was displacing something else that might also be needed. The 37 mail bags required to carry 150,000 one-page letters could be replaced by a single mail sack. The weight of that same amount of mail was reduced dramatically from 2,575 pounds to a mere 2,575 pounds. 45 pounds. The same information, the same connection between a soldier and his family, the same words, but in one version, you needed 37 mail sacks and a significant portion of a cargo hold. In the other, you needed a single sack and 45 pounds. In the first 2 years of the program, the military estimated that V-mail saved room for 5 million pounds of cargo. 5 million pounds of cargo space. Freed. Available for weapons and food and fuel and the material that kept the war going. V-mail was not just a communications system. It was a logistical innovation that contributed directly to the Allied war effort. The letters that kept soldiers sane were being used to free up the ship space that kept soldiers supplied. It is one of those moments in history where the human and the operational converge in a solution so elegant it almost doesn't look engineered. The technology behind V-mail was not new. It was borrowed, adapted, and deployed at a scale that was entirely without precedent. Microphotography had been used since the 1850s, primarily for business and banking. To keep track of checks and money, a machine called the checograph was developed. In 1928, Kodak debuted the WWII as a way to film documents, and in 1935, Kodak began filming and then publishing the New York Times on microfilm. The British, as they often did in this war, got there first. They implemented what they called the airgraph service in 1941, using the microfilm process to reduce the weight of mail sent to troops in North Africa and the Middle East. The system worked. The Americans noticed. And in June 1942, the United States Army, in collaboration with Eastman Kodak and other technological partners, launched its own version. They called it Victory Mail. Everyone called it V-mail. Instead of mailing a traditional letter, civilians and service members wrote on standardized 7 by 9-inch self-folding sheets. These letters were collected, censored, and then photographed onto 16 mm microfilm. Thousands of letters could be reduced to tiny images on a single roll of film. That film was then shipped overseas, often by air rather than by sea, where it was developed and printed out on small paper sheets measuring 4.25 by 5.25 inches. Those miniature letters were finally delivered to soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in the field. Let us walk through that process in real human terms, because the engineering of it is genuinely remarkable. A mother in Chicago sits down at her kitchen table. She takes out a V-mail form, standardized 8½ by 11-inch stationery, specially designed so the uniform size and weight paper could be photographed onto 16 mm microfilm. She writes. She is careful to write darkly, because the form instructs her, use typewriter, dark ink, or dark pencil, faint or small writing is not suitable for photographing. She fills the form with everything she wants to say to her son. The original forms could accommodate up to 700 typed words. She folds it. She mails it. All of the mail was funneled through 3 giant postal centers in New York, San Francisco, and Chicago. Kodak trained filmers to work with the Rekordak machines. At those centers, the letters arrived in enormous volumes. Workers, many of them women, part of the homefront workforce that had replaced the men now overseas, handled the forms, prepared them for filming, processed them through the censorship review, and then fed them through the Rekordak machines that reduced each letter to a thumbnail image on a roll of 16 mm microfilm. Between 1,500 and 1,800 letters could fit on a 90-foot long roll of film. Each reel weighed only 4 ounces. 4 ounces. A reel of film containing up to 1,800 letters from 1,800 families to 1,800 soldiers, weighing 4 ounces. That reel was then loaded onto an aircraft rather than a cargo ship, because aircraft were faster and submarines couldn't get them. It crossed the Atlantic or the Pacific in hours rather than weeks. The first large Army-operated V-mail station overseas was opened on April 15, 1943 at Casablanca, North Africa. At the receiving station, the film was developed and each image was printed at approximately 1/4 of its original size, producing the small but readable sheets that were then sorted and delivered to the individual soldier's unit. He received, in his hand, a letter that had been written full-size in Chicago, reduced to microscopic scale on a roll of film, flown across an ocean, and then re-enlarged to the size of a large index card. It was smaller than what his mother had written. Occasionally, the reproduction quality was imperfect and certain passages were difficult to read. But it was hers. Her handwriting. Her words. Her kitchen table in Chicago, translated into a 4-ounce reel of film and delivered to wherever in the world he currently was. Although the V-mail system was only used between June 1942 and November 1945, over 1 billion items were processed through these means. 1 billion. In 3 years. A billion tiny windows between the front and home, engineered into existence by a combination of Kodak microfilm technology, military postal organization, and the sheer human determination of millions of people who needed to reach each other across the distances that war had placed between them. There was, between the writing of a letter and its arrival at its destination, a person whose job it was to read it. Not a family member. Not the intended recipient. An officer. A military censor, holding a bottle of black ink and a very specific mandate. The censors were looking out for 2 things. They didn't want the soldier to say anything that would be of value to the enemy, such as where they were. They always wanted to camouflage how strong the troops were. Loose lips sink ships was the phrase that was very prevalent in World War II, and that was the theory in World War I as well. Loose lips sink ships. The phrase had been on posters and in newspapers for years before the war began and was so thoroughly embedded in American wartime culture that even civilians understood its implications. Information, casually shared, found its way to people who could use it. A letter describing the movement of a unit, the location of a supply depot, the number of men in a battalion, any of those details, in the wrong hands, could translate into dead soldiers. The calculus was not hypothetical. It was operational. The enlisted soldier was censored by an officer in his unit. Early in World War II, soldiers couldn't say where they were. People back home didn't know if their son was in the Pacific or the Atlantic. The officer assigned to censor his unit's outgoing mail was reading the letters of the men he commanded. Personal letters. Letters to wives and mothers and girlfriends. Letters containing the specific, unguarded emotional content that a man produces when he is writing to someone he loves in the absence of any audience he's aware of. The censor was the hidden audience. He read everything. He made judgments about what constituted a military security risk and what did not. And then, with his black ink or his scissors, he removed what he determined needed removing. First, scuffing the paper, then running a bead of impenetrable black ink could obliterate forbidden text. A second technique involved cutouts with a sharp blade. That physical act. The black ink drawn through a sentence, or the blade cutting a passage out entirely, leaving a rectangular hole in the paper through which the light showed through. Imagine receiving a letter from your son or husband overseas and finding these holes and these black bars. You could see the shape of what had been removed. You could count the words that weren't there. You knew he had written something and that something had been taken out, and you didn't know whether it was a location, France, Italy, the Pacific, or something else. Something worse. In some cases, over half the letter would either be blacked out or cut out by the censor. Imagine waiting for weeks, or even months, for a letter from a loved one only to find that you can only read 1/3 of what they wrote. 1/3 of a letter. 2/3 removed. The silence where the words had been almost louder than the words that remained. A letter full of holes was still a letter. It was still his handwriting on the parts that weren't removed. It still told you he was alive on the date he wrote it, which was the most essential information of all. But it was also a reminder of everything you didn't and couldn't know. Of how far away he was and how little you understood of the world he was living in and how many questions you were carrying that wouldn't be answered until the war was over, if they were answered at all. Officers were also looking to see any weakening of desire among the troops. It was very important in wartime for officers to know about morale issues. The censorship was a two-way instrument. It removed information that might help the enemy. But it also provided the army with a real-time window into the psychological state of its fighting force. Letters were data. A unit whose men were writing home about exhaustion and despair and loss of faith in the mission was a unit with a morale problem that needed addressing. A unit whose men were writing with confidence and energy and purpose was a unit that was holding together psychologically. The censor's office knew things about a unit's internal condition that the formal command structure might not see for weeks. Postal censorship was implemented to deprive the enemy of information, as well as tangibles such as funds and commodities, and to collect myriad intelligence that could be turned against the enemy. Intelligence. Not just security. The censor was a collector of human intelligence, reading the letters of the enemy as avidly as the letters of his own side, looking for information about supply situations, troop strength, unit positions, and morale, the soft, human intelligence that the battlefield itself couldn't always provide. Many letters written in foreign languages would simply not be sent because they rarely could be properly censored, often an enormous problem for the many troops born into immigrant families. An immigrant soldier writing home to his mother in Italian or Polish or Yiddish, writing in the language of his childhood, the language in which love and longing expressed itself most naturally, could find his letter simply not delivered. Because the army didn't have enough censors who could read every language. Because the default was suspicion rather than accommodation. Because the man who had grown up in Brooklyn speaking Yiddish at home and English in the street was now, in the army's administrative logic, a potential security problem when he reverted to the language of his childhood to tell his mother he was alive and thinking of her. The censorship system was necessary. It was also imperfect, inconsistent, and occasionally arbitrary. Some censors were strict. Others were lenient. Some cut out anything that looked like it might possibly be misconstrued. Others made genuine judgments about what constituted a genuine security risk. A soldier, when writing to his family about his highlights of France, mentioned a famous statue, only for the censor to remove its name, leaving a blank in the middle of a sentence about a church he had visited. The name of a statue. In a cathedral. Removed by a censor who had decided, for reasons he took with him to the grave, that this particular piece of cultural tourism information was a threat to Allied operational security. There is, in that image, something both tragic and absurd about the machinery of wartime censorship. A man trying to share a moment of beauty, walking through a French cathedral, seeing something magnificent, wanting to tell his family about it, and the institutional response removing the name of what he saw, leaving a gap in the story that the family could never fill. There was a limit to what words on paper could do. Letters could carry love and news and reassurance. Letters could describe weather and home and the progress of the vegetable garden. But letters could not carry the smell of a kitchen. They could not carry the texture of homemade food. They could not carry the specific, physical reality of home that a soldier's body remembered even when his mind was occupied with other things. For that, there was the package. Care packages contained home comforts, from socks and scarves, to homemade preserves and cake. That list. Socks and scarves and homemade preserves and cake. Every item in a care package was a physical fragment of the world the soldier had left. The socks his mother knitted were not just warm socks. They were his mother's hands, and her patience, and the specific domestic act of sitting in an armchair with wool and needles, making something useful for someone she loved who was far away and might be cold. The cake was not just cake. It was her kitchen, and the smell of baking, and the particular afternoon that existed in his memory as a sensory whole, the warmth, the smell, the sound of the radio in the background, compressed into a parcel that had traveled 12,000 miles and arrived slightly crumbled and possibly a little stale and the best thing he had eaten in months. One story stands out, a family getting together and spending all afternoon baking cookies for the older brother's birthday. Before they packed up the cookies to send off, they took a bite out of each one. They took a bite out of each one. Brothers and sisters and parents gathering in a kitchen and biting each cookie before it went into the package, leaving their mark on it, making it a shared thing rather than just a gift. The soldier received a box of slightly bitten cookies that had arrived from the other side of the world. He knew exactly what it meant. He knew whose teeth had left which marks. He could probably have matched each bite to a face. That is what a care package actually was. Not a supply delivery. A physical act of love, specific and personal, made concrete in objects that could cross oceans. The American Red Cross provided relief packages as well. During the war, 27 million Red Cross parcels were distributed to prisoner of war camps in Europe and the Pacific, containing tinned food, cigarettes, and chocolate. 27 million parcels. To prisoners of war. Men who were not just far from home but imprisoned, without freedom of movement, without access to regular mail, without the ordinary routines that gave structure to a soldier's day. For those men, a Red Cross parcel was not a supplement to their rations. For many, it was the margin between adequate nutrition and starvation. For all of them, it was the only reminder available that the world outside the wire knew they existed and had not forgotten them. While many packages were intercepted by Nazis and used for their own use, the Japanese provided almost no cooperation to the international Red Cross efforts. In some cases, the prisoners in German POW camps would keep only the cigarettes and chocolate, then volunteer the rest of the food articles to the Nazi camp cooks. Even in captivity, the transaction was complex and human. Men preserving what they could. Navigating the specific economy of deprivation that a POW camp created. Deciding what was worth keeping and what was worth trading, and calculating those decisions with the particular pragmatism that extreme circumstances develop in even the most ordinary person. Let us try to measure something that resists measurement. The effect of a letter from home on the psychological state of a man in combat. Soldier Worth K. Baird wrote in his diary on a day mail arrived, "Her letters do so much to pick me up. It's just like a new spark of life. She's a sweet wife." And on a day it did not, no mail again. This mail situation is getting terrible. No one on the rock is getting mail. The weather has cleared too. Must be a big movement going on somewhere. The swing between those two diary entries, the illuminated quality of a day mail arrived against the gray flatness of a day it didn't, captures the morale effect in its most direct form. It wasn't about information. Whatever his wife's letter contained, the news of ordinary life, the small domestic events of home, wasn't tactically or strategically significant. It didn't change the military situation. It didn't affect the outcome of the battle being fought on his island. What it changed was his experience of being there. His inner weather. The quality of the day. Whether the world felt connected and purposeful or hollow and random. A letter arrived and suddenly the distance between an island in the Pacific and a house somewhere in America seemed bridgeable. Not bridged, but bridgeable. He was still there. She was still there. The connection existed. And on the days the mail didn't come, the distance was total. The island was just an island. The war was just a war. And the question of why any of it mattered settled into the mind and had to be wrestled back out with nothing to help but memory. Reports compiled by the Morale Office showed that mail emerged as a pivotal factor in maintaining a unit's fighting spirit. Pivotal. Not helpful. Not beneficial. Pivotal. The research, conducted by the Army's own analysts who studied unit morale with the same rigor that other analysts applied to weapons effectiveness, consistently returned the same finding. Mail was central. Units that received regular mail maintained higher morale, better discipline, lower rates of psychological breakdown. Units cut off from mail for extended periods showed measurable declines in all three. The correlation was so consistent and so strong that military commanders in every theater understood, with practical clarity, that getting the mail through was an operational imperative. Journalist Howard Whitman, referring to the men who received Dear John letters, surmised, "It is doubtful if the Nazis will ever hurt them as much." The Dear John letter. The most dreaded piece of correspondence in the military mail system. The letter that began, as the archetype always did, with a formal salutation, "Dear John," when the soldier was accustomed to something warmer, something that told him the emotional temperature before the words began, and the formality told him everything before he read another line. Large numbers of American troops were stationed overseas for many months or years, and as time passed, some of their wives or girlfriends began relationships with other men. As a writer in the Democrat and Chronicle of Rochester, New York, put it in August 1945, "Dear John," the letter began. "I have found someone else whom I think the world of. I think the only way out is for us to get a divorce." They usually began like that, those letters that told of infidelity on the part of the wives of servicemen. The men called them "Dear Johns." The men called them "Dear Johns." With the particular linguistic efficiency that soldiers develop for every experience that needed naming, they reduced this specific category of devastation, the letter that ended the relationship you had been sustaining across years and oceans on the strength of letters and memory and the promise of return, to 2 words. And then they folded the letter. And they were still in France or the Pacific. And the next day's duties were the same as the previous day's duties. And the war didn't pause. The mail call came again the next day. They just weren't waiting for that one name to be called anymore. Soldiers were often gone from home so long that the correspondence they exchanged with their families and friends became the only way of maintaining those relationships. Many young couples, married or about to be, found it impossible to maintain the intimacy they had once shared. The intimacy. That specific word. The knowledge of a person that comes from physical proximity, from shared meals and shared spaces and the accumulated daily experience of someone's company, that intimacy could not be maintained across 3 years and 12,000 miles with paper and ink. It could be approximated. It could be pointed at. It could be kept alive in the way that a small fire can be kept alive in a large wind, by constant tending and careful shelter. But it could not be what it had been before the war interrupted it. It could not be what it would eventually need to become again, when the war ended and the men came home and found themselves standing in front of people they loved who had become, in some ways that mattered enormously, strangers. The mail tried to bridge that gap. Sometimes it succeeded. Sometimes it didn't. But the trying was itself the thing. The writing and the sending and the waiting and the reading and the writing back, that entire human circuit, maintained across the machinery of V-mail and censors and army postal workers and APO addresses, was the act of refusing to let the distance win. There is a unit in this story that most people have never heard of, and whose contribution to the morale of the American fighting force in the European theater was so significant and so completely overlooked for so long that it deserves its own moment of careful attention. In 1944, the Army confronted a problem that had been building for years. The volume of mail flowing to American troops in Europe had overwhelmed the sorting infrastructure available to handle it. Warehouses in Birmingham, England, were full. Not partially full. Full to the point that an estimated 17 million pieces of mail were sitting unsorted and undelivered, some of it dating back more than a year. Soldiers had stopped expecting to receive certain letters because they'd written them off as lost. Families had stopped expecting responses because the responses seemed to disappear. The solution that arrived in Birmingham was the 6,888 Central Postal Directory Battalion. 855 black women. The first and only all-black, all-female unit to serve in Europe in the Second World War, commanded by Major Charity Adams, dispatched to Birmingham to deal with the backlog that no other unit had managed to clear. They worked 3 8-hour shifts a day, 7 days a week, in a blacked-out warehouse that had previously been a converted riding stable. The conditions were cold and the work was painstaking. Each piece of mail had to be identified, the recipient located, the forwarding address determined, and the piece directed to the correct unit. This sounds straightforward until you understand that soldiers moved constantly, units were reorganized regularly, and addresses changed with a frequency that the original senders had no way of tracking. Their motto was not complicated. No mail, low morale. They cleared the backlog in 3 months. A backlog that military estimates suggested would take 6 months minimum. 17 million pieces of lost correspondence, found and sorted and sent. Letters that had been written in 1943 arriving at their recipients in 1945. Letters that men had given up on. A soldier in France receiving a piece of mail with a postmark almost 2 years old, recognizing the handwriting, not yet knowing what the letter said, holding it for a moment before opening it, understanding that it had crossed an ocean and waited in a warehouse and been found by someone who understood, with absolute practical clarity, that it needed to be delivered. No mail, low morale. No mail, low morale. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they did it, every shift, in a cold warehouse in Birmingham, for every piece of mail in that backlog, because those pieces of paper were not just logistics problems. They were the human connections that the war was trying to sever. And the women of the 6,888th were, in every meaningful sense, fighting back. Not every letter completed its journey. Some letters were returned marked, missing in action, or, whereabouts unknown. Mail was an invaluable lifeline to those at home. Missing in action. Written on an envelope that had traveled from a living room in America to a processing center to a microfilm reel to a developing station in North Africa or England and then to the army postal system in France, and then returned, with those 3 words stamped on it, to the person who wrote it. Think about that journey. You wrote a letter. You sent it forward. It traveled all that distance. And then it came back. Not with a response in a different handwriting. Just the same envelope you sent, with a stamp on it, and those 3 words. Your son. Your husband. Your brother. Missing in action. You didn't know what that meant. Missing could mean many things. It could mean dead. It could mean captured. It could mean separated from his unit in the chaos of a retreat, unaccounted for in the immediate aftermath of a battle, his status unknown to the army because the battle had been bad and the record-keeping had been imperfect. Missing in action was not a notification of death. But it was not a notification of life either. It was the specific military bureaucracy's way of saying, we don't know. Telegrams informed family members that their loved ones had been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, while the infamous "Dear John" letters breaking off relationships became notorious sources of heartbreak. The telegram was the other thing. The thing that arrived not in the regular mail but from a messenger at the door. The yellow envelope. The formal language. Regret to inform you. The words that meant the letter you were waiting for was never going to come, because the person you wrote to was gone. Mail sent to soldiers might have been returned to senders with the heartbreaking news that the recipient was killed or missing in action. And somewhere, in a warehouse somewhere, there was a package. Maybe cookies. Maybe a photograph. Maybe a scarf knitted over long evenings with someone in mind. A package addressed to someone who was no longer there to receive it. The unopened package. A tribute to those who did not come home. When we look at the package, we don't know whether it was intended for a man or a woman or what rank or job the person held. What we know is that they served their country, right alongside their comrades. The unopened package. The letter returned marked missing. The V-mail form sitting in a processing center, never printed, never delivered, because the address no longer corresponded to a living person. These were the edges of the system. Where the extraordinary human effort to connect families across war broke against the irreducible fact of what war was and what it did. V-mail was promoted as patriotic with advertisements emphasizing contributions to the war effort, such as saving cargo space and providing messages to lift spirits. Lifting spirits. The most straightforward description of what the whole extraordinary apparatus was for. The microfilm and the Kodak machines and the postal centers in New York and San Francisco and Chicago and the developing stations in Casablanca and Birmingham and the postal workers and the censors and the 6,888th in their cold warehouse. All of it in service of the act of lifting the spirits of young men in foxholes and on ships and in tents and in hospitals who needed to know that home still existed and still held a place for them. The V-mail system's savings were enormous. 2,500 pounds of paper letters in 37 mail sacks could be condensed into only 45 pounds of film in one mail sack. The use of V-mail also inadvertently deterred espionage, as only photocopies of letters were being sent, invisible ink and microdots were rendered useless. An anti-espionage measure. Inadvertent but effective. Because a photocopied letter could not carry invisible ink, could not conceal microdots, could not be used as a transmission medium for anything other than the visible words written on its surface. The process that was designed to save shipping space also eliminated one of the primary vectors for wartime intelligence transmission. The engineers who designed V-mail were solving a logistics problem and accidentally solving a security problem simultaneously. That is the quality that runs through the entire story of military mail in the Second World War. Solutions that addressed one problem and turned out to be addressing several. Systems that were built for operational efficiency and turned out to be sustaining human beings. Paper and microfilm and black ink and postal workers in warehouses, performing acts of engineering and logistics that were also, at their core, acts of love, connecting people who needed connection across the largest and most destructive war in human history, using every available technology, working every available shift, clearing every available backlog. Because the mail mattered. Not as an optional supplement to military operations. Not as a morale luxury that could be reduced when shipping space was tight. As an essential operational element in the maintenance of a fighting force. As the thread that kept millions of individuals tethered to the world that had sent them out and was waiting to receive them back. No mail, low morale. 4 words. The whole story, compressed. And somewhere tonight, in an archive in Washington or a box in someone's attic, there is a letter. Folded along creases that have gone soft from repeated reading. Written in a hand that might be 70 or 80 years gone. Passed through a censor's office. Traveled on microfilm across an ocean. Printed at 1/4 its original size and delivered to a man in a foxhole who read it slowly, savoring every word, and then folded it and kept it in his chest pocket, close to his heart, for the rest of the war. That letter is still a bridge. It still carries whatever it was built to carry. And reading it now, you can still feel, across 8 decades, the distance it was crossing. And the person on each end who needed it to arrive. Here is a truth about war that every general who ever lived understood instinctively and every historian of military logistics has spent considerable effort documenting. An army marches on its stomach. That phrase is almost always attributed to Napoleon. Whether he actually said it in precisely those words is one of those historical arguments that academics enjoy and which doesn't especially matter, because the truth it contains predates Napoleon by 2,000 years and has been confirmed, repeatedly and expensively, by every army that ever went hungry at the wrong moment. Feed your soldiers and they fight. Starve them and they don't. The mathematics of it are entirely unambiguous. A body without fuel doesn't function. A mind without nutrition makes poor decisions. A fighting force that has been marching for 12 hours on an empty stomach is not the same fighting force that marched out well-fed that morning. The physical degradation is real. The morale degradation is real. And the enemy, if they have been paying attention, knows exactly what to do with it. So the history of warfare is also, whether people realize it or not, the history of feeding warfare. Of the ovens and the wagons and the field kitchens and the remarkable German device nicknamed the goulash cannon that somehow made it from 1892 to the Second World War and fed hundreds of thousands of men on 2 continents. Of the cooks who worked under fire to produce something hot for men who hadn't eaten in 2 days. Of the logistics officers who understood that moving food forward was as important as moving ammunition forward. This is that story. The earliest armies in history solved the food problem the same way they solved most problems. Individually. Each man carried what he could, foraged what he found, and cooked what he had over whatever fire was available. It was a system that worked reasonably well for small raiding parties and broke down with considerable speed when the force grew large enough that everyone foraging in the same area produced competition, resentment, and eventually the kind of stripped landscape that had nothing left for the soldiers who arrived after the first wave. The Romans, who built the most sophisticated military machine the ancient world produced, understood this problem earlier than most and addressed it with their characteristic combination of engineering practicality and administrative thoroughness. When at war, luxury was left behind and the Roman legionnaire ate a staple three things: wheat, oil, and wine, an extremely Mediterranean combination. Numerous sources tell us that many Roman legionnaires were able bakers and cooks. Each man was expected to carry his own food, and when camp was made, a soldier would grind his wheat into flour using a mill, which was often shared with many other soldiers. The Quintubernium, the squad of 8 men that formed the smallest unit of the Roman legion, was also the basic cooking unit. 8 men shared equipment, shared a tent, and shared the labor of food preparation. Every group of 8 soldiers had a frying pan that folded away in their pack and enabled them to have a fry-up even on campaign. A folding frying pan. The Roman legionnaire's version of field cooking equipment, carried in the pack alongside armor and weapons and the tools needed to build a camp every single night. Flour, water, and salt were mixed and allowed to rise, then cooked under a clibinus, a small, bell-shaped bread oven placed in a fire until the bread was done. Animal fat from a soldier's meat ration was often added to increase the calorie count of the loaf. But the Romans also produced something more durable for the march. The biscuit, buxalatum, was a simple biscuit made of flour, salt, and water, with high hardness. It was baked twice at low temperature for a long time, so as to be sure that no moisture got inside. Such food was ideal in the military, where unfavorable weather conditions could be expected. What's more, the biscuit could be quickly consumed and energized. Baked twice. Low and slow. To remove every trace of moisture and produce something that would last for weeks without spoiling. The Roman hardtack biscuit was, in concept, identical to the hardtack that American Civil War soldiers complained about bitterly, 17 centuries later. The technology didn't change because the problem didn't change. You needed food that didn't spoil on the march, that provided energy, that could be eaten quickly in conditions where stopping to cook wasn't an option. Barley was considered a grain suitable only for animals and barbarians. Often, as punishment, soldiers received a ration of barley instead of wheat. That detail says everything about the psychology of ancient military food. Wheat was dignity. Barley was shame. The food a soldier received communicated his standing, his conduct, his relationship with the institution he served. Getting barley meant you had failed in some way visible enough to attract punishment. Getting wheat meant you were, at minimum, in acceptable standing. Even 2,000 years ago, the military understood that food was never just fuel. It was always also a message. The Roman legionary would have been well fed on a balanced, if simple, diet. This could be one of the reasons behind their military superiority: a well-fed soldier fights better. Well-fed. By the standards of the ancient world, the Roman soldier ate consistently well. The empire had built the logistics network, granaries, supply roads, procurement systems, to make that possible. And the consequence was visible every time a Roman legion met an enemy army that had been foraging and scrounging and marching on empty stomachs. The Romans were not just better trained and better equipped. They were better fed. And over the course of a long campaign, that margin compounded. Napoleon Bonaparte was, among other things, the first military leader to understand food supply as a strategic problem requiring systematic scientific solution. Not because his predecessors had ignored the problem, every general who ever starved a campaign into failure had understood it, too late, but because Napoleon approached it with the methodical, analytical mind he brought to everything, and because he had the political and institutional power to translate his conclusions into action. His armies were enormous. The Grande Armée at its peak numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Moving those hundreds of thousands across Europe, from France to Poland to Russia to Spain, required a supply system of almost incomprehensible complexity. Food was the heaviest and most perishable component of that system. Every day's delay meant food that had spoiled. Every battle that disrupted the supply line meant soldiers who were hungry at the worst possible moment. The first field kitchens were carried in four-wheeled wagons by military units on campaigns throughout history, often part of larger wagon trains, used as late as the 19th century. The wagon was Napoleon's field kitchen. His armies moved with enormous supply trains, wagons carrying flour, biscuit, salt meat, wine, and the firewood and cooking equipment needed to prepare it. The system worked in Western and Central Europe where the roads were adequate and the wagons could keep pace with the army. It broke down catastrophically when Napoleon pushed into Russia, where the roads dissolved into mud and snow, the supply wagons fell behind the army, and the Grande Armée found itself in one of the most hostile environments on earth with the logistical system that had served in France unable to function in Siberian winter conditions. But Napoleon's contribution to military food history went beyond the wagons. He was the driving force behind the first modern military food preservation technology. In 1795, facing the chronic problem of food spoilage that undermined his campaigns, Napoleon offered a prize of 12,000 francs to anyone who could develop a reliable method of preserving food for military use. Nicolas Appert eventually won the prize by developing the process of hermetic sealing, cooking food in sealed glass containers, destroying the bacteria that caused spoilage, and producing what was essentially the first canned food. The military implications were enormous. Food that could be sealed and preserved for months meant armies that could carry their supply further, plan further ahead, and maintain fighting effectiveness in environments where local foraging was impossible. The 19th century followed that innovation with metal canning, which was lighter and more durable than glass. By the time of the American Civil War, canned goods were standard military rations. By the First World War, the food that sustained armies was a product of Napoleon's prize competition, industrialized and scaled to feed millions. By the time the First World War began in 1914, military food technology had been quietly transformed by an invention that appeared not in a laboratory or a government program but in a small city in western Germany in 1892. Karl Rudolf Fissler of Idar-Oberstein invented a mobile field kitchen in 1892 that the Germans came to refer to as a Gulaschkanone, goulash cannon, because the chimney of the stove resembled ordnance pieces when disassembled and limbered for towing. The goulash cannon. The name alone tells you something about the soldiers who used it. Here was a piece of equipment that could genuinely make the difference between a hot meal and cold rations in the field, and the men it fed named it after both what it resembled and what it produced. A cannon that fired goulash. A weapon deployed not against the enemy but on his behalf, on behalf of the human need for something warm that tasted like food rather than like the can it came in. German soldiers during World War I quickly dubbed it Die Gulaschkanone. In the city of Idar-Oberstein in the Rhineland-Palatinate, Herr Karl Rudolf Fissler had invented the modern mobile field kitchen for use in theaters of war. The design was elegant in its practicality. A horse-drawn cart containing a coal-fired cooking vessel large enough to prepare soup, stew, or porridge for a company of soldiers. The kitchen could cook while being moved, fire burning, pot simmering, the meal being prepared in transit so that when the unit stopped, the food was ready. Not an hour after stopping, not after the cooks had set up and gathered wood and waited for water to boil. Ready. Hot. Immediately available. This was the revolution. Not the food itself, but the timing. Armies had always eventually managed to feed their soldiers. What they hadn't managed, consistently, was feeding them hot food at the right moment, when they arrived at a position exhausted, when they needed to eat quickly and resume the march, when the cold was severe enough that a hot meal was the difference between a functioning soldier and a hypothermic one. The goulash cannon moved with the army. It cooked continuously. It arrived ready. In the trenches of the First World War, this capability was both a logistical asset and a tactical vulnerability. The smell of cooking from a field kitchen was a navigational aid for enemy artillery. A kitchen producing hot food produced smoke and smell that carried across no man's land on the right wind direction and told the other side exactly where a unit was positioned and when it was eating. Feeding soldiers in the front line required moving the kitchen far enough back to be safe and then transporting the food forward, often in insulated containers, to maintain whatever heat survived the journey through the trenches. The hot food that arrived at the front line had usually started considerably hotter. But soldiers who had been living in cold mud for days did not complain about food that had cooled slightly in transit. They just ate it. By the Second World War, the field kitchen had evolved from Karl Fissler's 1892 horse-drawn prototype into a sophisticated piece of military equipment that armies on both sides deployed with serious logistical intent. To provide hot meals to Wehrmacht soldiers in the field, company kitchens were set up to prepare meals. Qualified cooks were in charge of these issues, who also used the services of assistants. The cooked food was distributed either directly into soldiers' pots or into special large thermoses for delivery to units located at a certain distance from the kitchen. The Wehrmacht used field kitchens of several types, large kitchens cooking for between 125 and 225 soldiers, or smaller kitchens for 60 to 125 people. They were transported either on a trailer behind vehicles or by a team of horses. The Wehrmacht's version of the goulash cannon was the direct descendant of Fissler's invention, refined over 50 years of military use. It could be horse-drawn or vehicle-towed. It could be installed in the back of a truck for fully mobile operation. It was manned by trained military cooks who understood that feeding soldiers in the field was not a comfort service but an operational requirement. And it produced, in conditions ranging from the North African desert to the Russian winter, whatever combination of available ingredients could be turned into something nutritionally adequate and, when the cooks were skilled and the supplies were reasonable, something that actually tasted like food. Soldiers' humor gave the field kitchens the name Gulaschkanone, goulash cannon. The name had migrated from World War I to World War II intact, because some things about the soldier's relationship with the institution feeding him don't change between generations. The kitchen that saved you from another day of cold rations got a name that combined affection and absurdism. A cannon. A weapon. Deployed in your direction with hot soup. On the Allied side, the American approach to mobile field feeding reflected the broader American approach to the war, technologically ambitious, logistically sophisticated, and backed by an industrial capacity that could produce equipment at scales other nations couldn't match. The U.S. Army's field kitchens were trailer-mounted units that could be towed by jeeps or trucks, set up in minutes, and produce hot meals for hundreds of men from whatever ingredients the supply system had delivered. Any semi-well-prepared, semi-hot meal could be a huge morale booster. Access to fresh supplies was usually very limited, but military cooks scrounged, bartered, traded, and substituted. Since food can have a huge impact on morale, the cooks did everything they could to keep everyone happy. The cook. The military cook in the Second World War occupied a role that was simultaneously undervalued in the formal hierarchy and essential to the day-to-day functioning of every unit he served. He was not a combat soldier. He was not building the battle plans. He was not driving tanks or flying aircraft or making the decisions that shaped the operational outcome of the campaign. What he was doing was standing over a fire and weather that was frequently trying to kill him, working with ingredients that were frequently inadequate, producing food for men who hadn't eaten properly in days, and understanding with absolute clarity that the meal he was about to serve was not just nutrition. It was, in the specific conditions of the Second World War, a statement of institutional care. A hot meal said, the system is still working. Someone is still thinking about you. You are not alone in this. In World War II, the mobile canteen was used as a morale booster in the United Kingdom, fitting in with the culture of the tea break and in particular as a result of the successful wartime experiment of the tea lady on productivity and morale. The British took a characteristically specific approach. While the Americans and Germans prioritized hot meals, the British added hot tea. The mobile canteen in the UK context was less about full meals and more about the restorative power of a cup of tea, which in British wartime culture was less a beverage than a statement of resilience. The tea break was the British equivalent of the American field kitchen meal, a moment of organized warmth that said the war hadn't entirely taken over everything. Nobody told you where you were going. That was the first thing you noticed. You boarded in New York or San Francisco or Boston, walked up the gangway with your kit and your rifle, and the ship moved, and the American coastline disappeared behind you into the gray Atlantic haze. And that was it. No announcement. No destination posted anywhere. Just open ocean in every direction and 10,000 other soldiers around you in a vessel that had been, until recently, one of the most elegant passenger ships on Earth. The liners had been gutted and great rows of tiered bunks filled their hulls. SS America, renamed USS West Point, could carry nearly 8,000 troops, and its speed meant it could sail without escorts, capable of outrunning German U-boats. Aboard ship, the troops, most of whom had never been on a ship before, endured crowded conditions, jammed mess halls with waiting lines of up to an hour, seasickness, and boredom. The sleeping situation hit you first. Standee bunks were tiered sleeping spaces stacked up as high as 6 feet. There was only an 18-inch clearance between each standee, which did not help any soldiers who might be claustrophobic. Sleeping was done on a rotation basis, with each bunk shared by the men. In addition, at any given time 1/3 of the troops would sleep topside on the open deck. Most GIs actually preferred outside, which was less dank and claustrophobic. Besides, the men reasoned rightly that those topside would have a better chance for survival if the ship was torpedoed. 18 inches between your face and the underside of the bunk above you. In a compartment below the waterline. On a ship being hunted by submarines. If the mathematics of that situation produced anxiety, there was nowhere to put the anxiety except the open deck, which at least had the sky above it and the wind moving through it and the theoretical comfort of being able to see what was coming. The smell below decks was its own particular ordeal. Personal hygiene was difficult, and a salt water shower was an unsatisfactory experience. The soap was a rock-hard bar that produced no lather. When the salt dried on your skin, you felt worse than before. 10,000 men in enclosed spaces with inadequate ventilation, inadequate washing facilities, and an ocean that did not feel any obligation to remain flat while you tried to sleep. Seasickness moved through the compartments like contagion. One man sick made the smell worse. The smell made the next man sick. The sea made the smell worse still. Most men adapted eventually. The body found its sea legs and the horizon became manageable. But the first few days were a negotiation with your own biology that no amount of military training had covered. Food meant a line. You proceeded to a chest-high table running the width of the ship. Once there, you moved along the table, eating as you went, and at the end of the table you washed your tray. Waiting an hour to eat a meal that took 10 minutes to consume while the ship rolled beneath your tray was the daily rhythm. You got used to it because there was no alternative to getting used to it. After clearing the port of New York, we were allowed on deck to explore the ship. Life jackets were mandatory and deck space was at a premium. Bodies sprawled everywhere and card games of all types quickly sprang up. Card games. Dice. Conversation that circled endlessly around the same subjects: where you were from, what you did before, where you thought you might be going, what you planned to do when you got back. Writing letters you couldn't mail until you landed. Reading whatever paperback had survived enough hands to still hold its spine together. Newspapers and magazines were published aboard troopships to help relieve the boredom of the long journeys. Officers organized physical training on deck. There were boxing matches. There were makeshift concerts. Men who had been musicians or comedians in their civilian lives performed for audiences of thousands because everyone needed something to look at that wasn't the ocean. And underneath all of it was the submarine question. Everyone knew about the Battle of the Atlantic. Everyone understood that the ship was a target and that speed was the primary defense, and that the lookouts scanning the horizon were soldiers who had trained for land warfare, now staring at an ocean that offered no landmarks and hid things beneath it. At night the portholes were blacked out. During the day you watched the water. Nobody said much about it directly. But the boat drills happened twice a day and everyone attended them with a seriousness that card games didn't quite generate. The voyage to Europe took roughly 5 to 7 days at speed. The Pacific took weeks. Weeks in the standee bunks, weeks in the meal lines, weeks watching the water move past in every direction with no indication that it was ever going to stop. Men who had enlisted to fight a war spent significant portions of their military service simply crossing the ocean to reach it, and the crossing itself became a chapter of experience that many of them described in detail decades later: the smell, the bunks, the card games, the seasickness, the particular quality of standing on the deck at night with the ship moving fast through dark water toward a shore they couldn't yet see. The war was waiting. The ocean was just the distance between here and it. Nobody wins a war on courage alone. That is the lesson that generals learn and politicians forget, and military historians have been documenting patiently since the First Army marched further than its food could follow. The Second World War was decided on many things: strategy, leadership, technology, the industrial capacity of nations. But underneath all of it, holding the entire enterprise together like the foundation nobody photographs, was logistics. The science of getting the right thing to the right place at the right time, for 8 million men, across 2 oceans, in conditions specifically designed to make it impossible. Once overseas, each man required about 45 pounds of supplies per day: rations, clothing, fuel, medical supplies, and ammunition. 45 pounds. Per man. Per day. Multiply that by 8 million soldiers and the number becomes almost too large to hold in the mind. This was not a rounding error in the budget. It was the central operational challenge of the entire war. Modern armies consumed supply by adopting material-intensive modes of warfare. Machine guns and artillery fired enormous quantities of rounds that needed to be shipped from factories to the front, while tanks and trucks required massive amounts of fuel and spare parts. The frontline soldier saw the bullets and the shells and the fuel arriving and assumed, reasonably, that it had always been there. What he didn't see was the chain that produced it: factories in Ohio, ships across the Atlantic, ports in England, railroads across France, trucks on roads that had been destroyed and rebuilt within the same week. Railway repair crews followed the armies, rebuilding bridges and clearing tracks within hours of capture. Ammunition always came first in supply operations. Combat units burned through shells faster than anyone expected. Medical supplies were next. Food rations came third, even though everyone knew they mattered for morale. Ammunition first. Always ammunition first. Because a soldier without food could still hold a position for a day. A soldier without ammunition could not hold anything. At its busiest, the Red Ball Express truck convoy hauled about 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. The Red Ball Express, the round-the-clock truck convoy that ran dedicated supply routes across France after D-Day, driven largely by black soldiers who kept Patton's army moving when the railroad infrastructure couldn't keep pace with the advance. 12,500 tons. Daily. In trucks driven by men who had been told to eat, sleep, and drive, mostly drive, because the front was moving fast and the supplies had to move faster. For armies that cannot deploy their forces to the right location, produce enough weapons and ammunition, and provide the necessary logistics, defeat is inevitable. The Germans learned this at Stalingrad, where the Soviet Operation Uranus cut the supply chain in winter, and an army that could not get fuel or food or winter clothing was destroyed not by superior force alone but by the collapse of the line that connected it to everything it needed to survive. The Allied victory in the Second World War was a victory of production and distribution as much as it was a victory of fighting. Someone built the bullets. Someone moved them. Someone counted them and tracked them and ensured they arrived at the place where a soldier needed them, at the moment he needed them, in sufficient quantity to matter. Those people were also soldiers. They just never appeared in the recruitment poster. 2,000 years before the standee bunks and the powdered eggs and the V-mail forms, a young man woke up in a barracks room he shared with 7 other soldiers and began a day that would be, in its fundamental structure, surprisingly familiar. In a permanent fort, a soldier would wake in barracks shared with the men of his contubernium, the small group of roughly 8 soldiers who lived, ate, marched, and often camped together. The first moments of the day were practical rather than ceremonial. A soldier had to get up, put himself in order, check his clothing and equipment, and be ready for inspection or assignment. A man who was late, badly equipped, or inattentive was not only making himself look careless, he was disrupting the discipline of the unit. The Roman army ran on discipline the way a machine runs on oil. Remove it and everything ceased. The ordinary day in a Roman camp could include roll calls, inspections, work assignments, drill, repairs, cleaning, cooking, guard rotations, religious observances, and a constant expectation that soldiers must be ready for danger even while eating, resting, or sleeping. The camp was not a resting place. It was a controlled military space that happened to contain sleeping soldiers, and the distinction was not accidental. It was the entire point. Gaius wakes up early in the room he shares with the other 7 men of his squad. After dressing in his tunic, belt, and sandals, he heads down to a room at the end of the barracks block where there is a fire burning, chasing away some of the miserable cold of Britannia. Other early risers are making porridge and Gaius joins them. Porridge. The breakfast of an empire. Meals were usually simple and based heavily on grain, bread, and salted meat. Soldiers prepared food themselves, often using portable cooking equipment carried during campaigns. The Roman legionnaire was expected to be his own cook, baker, and quartermaster simultaneously. Roman soldiers were issued raw ingredients such as wheat, which they had to grind into flour and prepare as bread or porridge. Cooking was done in small groups, making soldiers highly self-sufficient during campaigns. The contubernium that fought together also cooked together, shared tools, shared the grinding stone, shared whatever the army's supply system had delivered and whatever the surrounding countryside had yielded. Then came the march. A Roman soldier typically carried between 30 and 40 kilograms of equipment, weapons, armor, tools, and food supplies. This heavy load earned them the nickname Marius Mules. Named for the general who reformed the army in the 2nd century BC and decided that soldiers who carried their own equipment were more reliable than soldiers who depended on a baggage train that lagged behind. So the legionnaire carried everything. On his back. In his hands. On the 20-mile days that Roman commanders considered a standard march and that would have destroyed most modern recreational hikers before lunch. Every afternoon they built a rampart around a different campsite, then made their meal from those bags of flour. Sooner or later, there might be a battle or a village to burn, but mostly life was just marching. Marching and building. Roman soldiers built camps every day to ensure safety and maintain discipline. Even after long marches, they constructed fortified camps with ditches and walls to protect themselves from surprise attacks. After 20 miles on foot carrying 40 kilograms, the Roman soldier did not rest. He dug. He built a ditch, raised a rampart, erected the camp in the precise, standardized layout that every legionnaire had memorized in training, because a camp built to standard in the dark by exhausted men was still a defensible position. A camp built however exhausted men felt like building it was a liability. Polybius noted that Roman camps were designed with such consistency that every soldier knew exactly where his assigned place was located, regardless of where the army marched. This improved their efficiency as the troops could establish camps quickly because every legionary already understood the layout. The afternoon brought training even when the morning had brought marching. With only the afternoon to work in, they had marching drills, javelin practice, and combat with blunt weapons. The Roman army trained continuously, not because the soldiers were unskilled, but because the army understood something that most institutions take centuries to articulate clearly. Skill degrades without practice. Formation fighting requires every man to move as part of a mechanism, and mechanisms require constant calibration. A soldier who hadn't drilled in a week was a slightly less reliable component of the machine. The Roman army could not afford unreliable components. Battles showed what Roman soldiers could do in a few violent hours, but camp discipline showed how the army maintained itself day after day, season after season, and campaign after campaign. The punishment system enforced all of it. Decimation, the execution of 1 in every 10 men in a unit that had failed, was the most extreme instrument and rarely used precisely because its rarity made it devastating when it appeared. More commonly, punishment was physical labor, reduced rations, public humiliation, or the barley ration, the assignment of animal feed instead of wheat that told a soldier, in language everyone understood, that he had failed his unit standards. And yet within that severity was something that kept the system functional over centuries. The contubernium. 8 men. The same 8 men who shared a room, shared a tent, shared a cooking fire, covered each other's guard shifts, buried each other when the fighting was over. The Roman army's genius was not merely its discipline. It was that it built the discipline into small human units bound by proximity and shared experience and the particular loyalty that comes from living in close quarters with the same people for years. The legion was an institution. The contubernium was a family. And the family was what the soldier actually fought for. Their ability to march long distances, sustain themselves with simple resources, and remain organized under pressure allowed Rome to win wars, recover from defeats, and expand across vast territories. The strength of Rome was built not on great generals or decisive battles alone, but on the everyday lives of its soldiers. The everyday lives. The porridge at dawn and the 20-mile march and the camp built at dusk and the weapons cleaned before sleep. 2,000 years ago, in a barracks in Britannia or on campaign in Gaul or standing watch on the Rhine frontier, a young man was doing something structurally identical to what a young man would do in a barracks in Georgia in 1942. Rising early. Eating simply. Training constantly. Maintaining his equipment. Sleeping in close quarters with men he hadn't chosen and had come to depend on completely. What a soldier wears has never been just about keeping him warm. From the first organized armies in the ancient world to the olive drab of the Second World War, the clothes on a soldier's back have carried meaning that goes far beyond function. They told the battlefield who was friend and who was enemy. They told the enemy how powerful you were before you'd raised a weapon. They told the soldier himself, every morning he put them on, that he was part of something larger than himself. The uniform was never just clothing. It was communication. It was psychology. It was, occasionally, a catastrophic tactical liability, and the history of how armies figured that out is one of the more quietly dramatic stories in the history of warfare. Military uniforms are nearly as old as organized warfare itself. Armies in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia wore coordinated dress and equipment as early as 3000 BCE, helmets, shields, and distinctive garments that helped identify soldiers while signaling rank, loyalty, and authority. Although these early outfits were not uniforms in the modern sense, they served the same two goals that most military dress has always balanced: practicality on the battlefield and symbolic display. 3,000 years before Christ, someone looked at a group of armed men and understood that if they all wore the same thing, the battlefield became marginally less chaotic. You could see your own side. You could distinguish your flank from the enemy's. In the noise and smoke and terror of ancient combat, where formation discipline was the difference between victory and massacre, knowing who was next to you mattered enormously. The coordinated dress wasn't fashion. It was a survival tool. In ancient civilizations like Rome, soldiers didn't have standardized uniforms in the way we recognize today. Their armor and protective gear often varied based on rank, wealth, and the specific legion they belonged to. It was more about functionality and protection than projecting a unified image. The Roman legionnaires' larica segmentata, the segmented plate armor that has become the iconic image of the Roman soldier, was itself an evolution, replacing earlier mail and scale armor as metallurgy improved and commanders discovered what configurations of metal actually stopped what was being thrown at their men. The helmet was engineered. The shield was engineered. The sandals, famously, were engineered to survive 20-mile marches in conditions that destroyed ordinary footwear. The Roman military kit was a technology platform, updated continuously across centuries of operational experience. Then came the medieval period, and the soldier's clothing became something else again. With the rise of heraldry, knights and soldiers wore surcoats emblazoned with their lord's crests or their own personal symbols. This was crucial for identification on the chaotic battlefield. Imagine trying to figure out who's who in a clash of steel. It was also a way to showcase allegiance and status. The medieval battlefield was, in its visual logic, a moving mosaic of competing heraldic symbols. Your surcoat announced your lord, your family, your allegiance. It placed you in the feudal hierarchy at a glance. And in the smoke and chaos of a medieval engagement, where men in identical mail could not otherwise be distinguished from enemies in identical mail, the colored surcoat with its painted symbols was as operationally important as the sword underneath it. The knight's armor evolved over the medieval centuries from chainmail to plate, each generation of metallurgy and engineering producing something heavier, more protective, more expensive, and more precisely fitted to the specific threats that battlefield experience had identified. A fully armored knight in the 15th century was wearing something that represented decades of accumulated engineering knowledge, shaped to his body by craftsmen who understood both the physics of a lance strike and the biomechanics of fighting in metal. It was magnificent. It was also becoming obsolete, because gunpowder was arriving, and gunpowder did not care how expensive your armor was. As organized standing armies became more common in the 17th and 18th centuries, nations introduced standardized uniforms to create a sense of unity, discipline, and recognition on the battlefield. Cromwell's new model army dressed its foot soldiers in red coats. The coats were purchased from the lowest bidder, and Venetian red dye was the competitive choice in the mid-1600s. The result was impressive and terrifying, and served the British military well for more than 200 years. The British redcoat. One of history's most recognizable military images, and one of history's more accidental ones. The red wasn't chosen for symbolic reasons or psychological calculations about what color intimidated enemies most effectively. It was chosen because Venetian red dye was the cheapest option available to a military procurement process focused on cost. The battlefield psychology was a fortunate byproduct. The red coat said, to anyone who encountered it on any battlefield across 2 centuries of British imperial expansion, here is the British Army. It was a brand, built on accident, maintained by tradition, and eventually retired by necessity when rifles became accurate enough that being visible at 500 yards was no longer a survivable military posture. Then Napoleon. The grenadiers of Napoleon's Imperial Guard became famous for their towering bearskin caps, which added nearly a foot to their height and created a dramatic battlefield presence. Worn with dark blue coats, white crossbelts, epaulets, and red accents, the bearskins were heavy, hot, and uncomfortable, but they were designed to project invincibility and intimidate opponents. The idea was that splendid uniforms would astonish allies and overawe conquered peoples. The early 1800s were the ornamental high point, the acme of colorful and ornate uniforms in Western Europe. It was magnificent. It was also the beginning of the end of that entire approach to military dress. While these uniforms created a strong visual identity, they lacked practicality in combat, as bright colors made soldiers highly visible targets. Even as parade dress glistened, real battlefields were teaching hard lessons. Soldiers in white, blue, or red made excellent targets for increasingly accurate rifles. Napoleon's soldiers froze in their decorative coats on the Russian campaign. His cavalry rode into battle in uniforms designed for the parade ground and died in them on terrain that had not read the same aesthetic brief. The battlefield was giving consistent, expensive feedback about the gap between what looked impressive and what kept you alive, and by the mid-19th century, armies were finally beginning to listen. The transition into the 20th century marked a radical shift. World War I and World War II necessitated uniforms that prioritized camouflage and protection above all else. Khaki, olive drab, and camouflage patterns became the norm, blending soldiers into their surroundings rather than making them stand out. Khaki. The word itself comes from the Urdu for dust-colored, and it entered British military use through the Indian Army, where soldiers operating in the subcontinent had figured out independently what the European military establishment was slow to accept, that a soldier who couldn't be seen was a soldier who was harder to kill. During World War II, military uniforms became even more specialized to accommodate different combat roles and terrains. Paratrooper uniforms required reinforced clothing with extra pockets and padding for protection during jumps. Germany, the United States, and the UK began using specialized camouflage patterns to help soldiers blend into forests, deserts, and urban environments. The World War II combat uniform was the culmination of everything 3,000 years of military clothing experience had taught. It was durable. It was functional. It had pockets, an innovation whose importance to the fighting soldier cannot be overstated, in positions designed around what men actually needed to reach quickly in combat. It was colored and patterned not to impress but to disappear. Soldiers fighting in colder regions such as the Eastern Front were issued insulated clothing to withstand harsh winter conditions. The uniform adapted to the theater, to the terrain, to the specific tactical requirements of the fight being fought rather than the aesthetic requirements of the court being impressed.